Bret Mogilefsky, welcome to Tech Talk with Daniel.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Having both been a playtester and a developer at LucasArts, you had the unique position of being responsible for finding bugs in the classic LucasArts games, only later be responsible for adding bugs to other classic LucasArts games.
It's absolutely true, yeah.
So let's start at the beginning. How did you get started in the QA field?
By playing games and wanting a job. So we were lucky at this time. The game industry was small enough that you didn't have to have much of a background. I found out, my first summer job ever was in high school, and it happened to be at LucasArts and testing on Monkey Island, which sounds amazing now, but at the time it was just sort of a very obscure thing, and who knew this game would be a hit. The way I found out about it is that I have an older brother. His name is Wayne. Shout out to Wayne. Wayne went to film school. He loved special effects. He really wanted to work in the film industry getting out of school, but he didn't want to work in LA because he made the mistake of going into a field that forces you to live in LA. He wanted to know where he could work on film that was outside of LA. And so he was looking around. I was like, well, Lucasfilm, ILM, they're up in the Bay Area. They're not in LA. So he called their job hotline, which is how you found jobs at that time. You would look up the company and call a phone number and then listen to all the listings for the jobs, which seems ridiculous now. And at the very end of their listing, they said, we have an opening for a game tester in our new games division. And he said, well, I'm not interested in that, but my little brother is a gamer, and I know he's played a lot of these Lucasfilm games. He's talked about them a lot. So I'll let him know about it. So he told me about it. And I'd never had a job before, but I was going to work really hard to be a game tester at Lucasfilm Games. I just played Maniac Mansion and Zach McCracken and a few others. And so I made my resume. And you might ask, what does the resume look like for a junior in high school who's never had a job? And it would look like, I live here. This is my GPA. And here's all the games I've played. And here's all the games I've completed of those games. Here's all the ones that I've completed. And basically just saying, I play a lot of games and a lot of them were your games, or a lot of them were Sierra games that are sort of adjacent. I played a lot of Infocom games, from a very early age. I think one of my earliest gaming experiences was, I always remember two games: Wizardry on the IBM PC. And then the other one was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Infocom. And then along with that, all the Infocom, all the Zorks and Sorcerer, Enchanter, and Mind Forever Voyaging, and all the other different Infocom games. So I had I guess now looking back, it makes more sense because I had a long history of sort of what were adventure games at the time, which was the text adventures leading into the early Sierra and LucasArts stuff. So I guess that looked okay. I got a call saying, we're going to interview you. I hadn't really thought about it too much before then, but I lived in Fremont, California. They're in San Rafael, California. And so I had to drive, and it was like a 50-minute drive. And I was like, oh, this is going to be a big commute. So I drove up there. It was a beautiful sunny day, very hot day in Marin County. And you kind of drive on these back roads. And, I was being interviewed on Skywalker Ranch. Which is, kind of legendary. Like at the time where all these hushed sort of, in the back of Starlog magazine or whatever, there would be like these sort of accounts of somebody trick-or-treating at Skywalker Ranch and they got a prop gun or something like that dropped in their bag, or, so it was kind of this legendary place. And so I went up there, and it was very unobtrusive, and you don't even know until you're driving onto it that it's Lucas. It's totally unmarked, and they said, you're going to interview at the they say Gatehouse, not sure which, but the Skywalker Ranch has like all these buildings that are sort of they were designed to look like they've always been there, but they're all industrial kind of underneath. So it's like you drive up and like the stable house is ostensibly where all the stables were, it's where the horses and the wagons were parked. But in reality, you drive underground and it's like an underground parking garage. And then you come up and you're in kind of this sort of rustic looking area, and it's all very nicely landscaped. And so I was interviewed there, and I wore the best stuff I had as a 16-year-old kid, which was, a skinny tie in the 90s, and something I would wear to a high school dance. And I was ridiculously dressed up, but I was ridiculously hot in the hot sun. But I was interviewed outside of a building by people wearing, like of the time neon, like gotcha shorts and sunglasses, and a couple of them very casually strolling out. And those people were Kirk Ralston and Judith Lucero Turchin. They were the heads of the testing group at that time. This is before Lucasfilm Game moved off the ranch. So there was it was very small. There were like 17, maybe 20 people total. And they had kind of, only 3 or 4 people testing in a room. But they were expanding. And so they were interviewing me, and they're like, games you play? Have you ever found a bug? What's your approach to an adventure game? And they said, oh, this sounds good. Should we put them on Monkey? Monkey? Okay, yeah, let's put them on Monkey. All right, we're putting it on a game called Monkey Island, and can you start next week? And I was like, okay, sure. I didn't know what Monkey was, but as it happens, they were moving off the ranch, so I never worked a day on the ranch, even though I interviewed there. I went to eat lunch there many times, but I always felt like an intruder because I never actually worked there. But yeah, so that was my start. The day I showed up was the day they had moved everybody onto what's called the Kerner Complex, which is off Kerner Boulevard in Centerfeld. So this is more downtown Centerfeld, not in the rustic hills where, Skywalker Ranch is. And this is on the same sort of industrial lot that ILM was. It says Kerner Optical Company on the outside, but it was ILM. And we were moving into a building that ILM had vacated and it's kind of trashed. And I got to kind of walk in and see the new space with all the existing testers and staff as they were getting a tour around the whole facility. So I kind of snuck in along with the move, and I got a nickname that day which sticks around, and there was a whole culture around that. And then we sat down and started testing stuff. So I can go into any of that, but I feel like I've been talking forever. So I'll give you a chance to interrupt and say what sounds interesting to you. What do you want to hear more about?
So the first day that they showed everyone around the new location, you just started working there?
I just showed up. So they're like, oh, yeah, you're here. Get on the tour. And it's like, okay. So I got on the tour and they're introducing me to the other testers. And they said, what's your name? And I said, Bret. And they said, oh, that's not all right. We already have a Bret. And this was something that actually became a part of the LucasArts culture very early on, started from the testing, what's called the testing pit. The testers had this tradition that the second person with any given first name had to get a nickname. So there were 2 Mikes, two Brets, two Jeffs, 2 whatever. And I was the second Bret, so I had to get a nickname. And so they spent that time on the tour sort of batting around like, what should this new person's nickname be? Which gave me, it was very, very nice way to be introduced to people. Kind of, we're doing something together and we're all learning and it's all new for all of us. And they're sort of, getting to know me and deciding what they're going to call me. And that was interesting. At first they said I was going to be the big blue guy because I was wearing all blue. I happened to wearing a blue shirt and in the style of the time, athletic socks with blue rings on them and things, blue shorts. And then they said, big blue guy is too long to say, so we'll call him the blue guy. And they said, well, blue guy's not really a name, that's a description. What about beluga? That sounds more like a name. Well, what is a beluga? Beluga whale? No, beluga caviar. What is caviar? Caviar is fish eggs. We'll just call him Egg. And because I was the youngest person there, Egg stuck. So I was Egg to a lot of people. There are certain people I run into periodically now, and they'll say, Egg! And they just never knew me as any other name. When my first paycheck came in, the person came in and said, who's Bret Mogilefsky? Like literally, like I've been working with this person for 2 weeks and they didn't know that was my name. So yeah, that stuck. And, they gave us chances to buy, company swag, like ILM jackets, things like that. And the embroidery always said Egg on it, things like that. People called me Egg.
And the fine leather jackets.
Fine leather jackets. You can always buy, I'm selling these fine leather jackets. Yes. So yeah, so that was kind of getting into that group. The group is, rambunctious and rowdy, and they were, it was very much a growing group, as they said when I joined it. They had just started testing kind of first playables on Monkey Island. That wasn't what I tested initially because they needed me to test some ports because I had actually one of the few testers who had just joined who actually knew these previous games. So the first thing they had me test was the FM Towns version of Zach McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders. And I got to give a shout out right now to the FM Towns, a machine way ahead of its time that doesn't get enough credit in the world. But at the time, it was this really bizarre alien, PC from Japan that nobody really understood much about. It had a lot of documentation in Japanese. And it was unusual in that it had VGA graphics. And I believe it had ad-lib sound card built in. And then it also came with a CD-ROM drive, which was very, very new and totally unheard of. And they did special sort of up-resed VGA backgrounds for that game. So if you've ever seen, or if you work with Aaron Giles, this Dream emulator, the versions you want for the games of that era are the FM Towns versions, because those are the ones that were sort of, the
but they're not the definitive versions. The FM Towns versions may have 256 colors. Most of the definitive versions are usually the original ones. So for Zach, it's the original EGA 1. And for Loom, it's the original EGA 1. So I know that currently on Steam and on GOG, you get the FM Towns versions for all of these games. And with Loom, you get the CD audio version, which even Brian Moriarty doesn't like that much because...
He feels like it's a retrofit.
No, because they didn't have digitized sounds like they did in Fate of Atlantis and games that came out afterwards. They actually recorded the audio, the dialogue, in CD audio format, Redbook.
Oh my gosh.
So it was very limited because usually these CDs had like 72 minutes or 60 minutes, depending on the size.
And there's a limited number of tracks too, right?
And everything was truncated. So Loom had more than half of the dialogue removed from the CD version. Because of the way the CD-ROM drive works, they didn't want to change scenes when they started an audio track because it may cause a skip.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so they removed all of the close-ups from the game, because usually during a scene in which there's dialogue, you'd have the scene flip into a close-up and then flip back. So those were removed. So everything was removed from that game. So as much as you may love the FM Towns machine.
Well, not the Loom version. For me, it was Zach and the others. And those were not talkies. Those were more about just being able to hold the larger images for the backgrounds and higher res and deeper palette.
And how was it to hear the background sounds of the street in high fidelity?
It was pretty good. I recall it being like, everything here is better. And because it was a game that had already shipped and they had substantially mostly left the game engine intact and the game logic intact, it was mostly just looking for graphical glitches and audio glitches. And there weren't a ton at the time that I looked at it. So it was a very, I don't want to say it's a boring, but it was a straightforward job to do QA on that, because they basically just need people to play it, kind of what they call golden path, not really looking for bugs that weren't in the original game. Or only looking for bugs that weren't in the original game. And, but yeah, if I recall, it was nice. I liked it. I thought it was good. I thought it was a good change. It was good to see that this game was getting this nicer version, but it was a little mystifying even at the time that like it was going to go for such a small market, like so much work for such a tiny market. And I've got a story I'll tell you later about Grim Fandango on the Japanese market, it was my first thing that I did was retesting Zach for the FM Towns. And the next thing I did, they had me play Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. There were two versions of it. Temple of Doom, not Fate of Atlantis. Temple of Doom, which was sort of more of an action game. And they had another one, which was kind of a platformer. And I hated that game. I think most people did.
Are you talking about Last Crusade?
Sorry, Last Crusade. Yeah. What did I say?
Temple of Doom.
Temple of Doom. Yeah. Last Crusade. And then they were doing a lot of there's a little bit of other kind of, I don't want to call it shovelware at the time, but like licensing stuff. So like Night Shift was coming out around that time, things like that. But the one I was excited about, sorry, my animals are fighting. The one I was excited about was Fate of Atlantis. And I was the first tester on the first playable versions of Fate of Atlantis. And I was pretty excited about that one because it was a proper adventure game, but also I was early enough on it to have a lot of influence on it, which was surprising. It's surprising to say, like, what do I know? But at the time, and you may have heard this from other people, the LucasArts had this system for creating bugs, A through E. So A means it crashes the game can't be completed or prevents completion of the game. B is like, it's obviously a bug. Anybody who doesn't know anything about computers would still look at it and say it's a bug. C is like, it's a bug, but people who don't know might not realize it's a bug. D is like a problem with
design flaw.
Mm-hmm. And then E is suggestions. And it's like, changes things that should be there, feature suggestions, which they were open to at the time. And so I actually, somewhere in here, I have like a pile of, all of my D&E bugs for Fate of Atlantis. And there was a lot of them. So like, the opening of the game used to have him in a suit, and he wasn't recognizable as Indiana Jones. He didn't have the hat. He didn't have the jacket. He didn't have the whip. There was nothing. And he was, kind of falling through the attic in the university. I was like, how do I even know that I'm playing? I just bought this game. I don't see Indiana Jones. I see this schlub in a suit doing pratfalls. Like, this is not the heroic person I signed up to be. So there's a lot of 16-year-old me saying, yeah, what is it? What are you doing? This isn't Indiana Jones. But there were things in there, a lot of things I was able to add, and sort of being the first playable, was able to kind of be the first person to encounter them and sort of, head off some things early. I think some of the close-ups that appeared there were, again, based on that kind of feedback, that like, this doesn't feel like, we can't use Harrison Ford's likeness, but we could still do something that makes it clear this is indie, like, a little bit more close-up and a little more sort of, hat, whip, jacket, things that are iconic.
Now, before we continue with Fate of Atlantis, I want to get back to, first of all, Last Crusade, sure, the action game, which I also very much hated as a game because I couldn't get through it. Every time I'd either get hit by the spikes or the things that are falling from the spikes themselves onto Indy and killing him immediately. And I was always confused by the fact that the sprites that they used for the enemies are the same sprites as Indies, so they all look the same on screen.
Yeah.
And so
it felt like a game that was supposed to go to an arcade somewhere, and then somebody made a decision this was going to be a home computer game and had no idea what that meant in terms of limitations or the audience or anything. It just felt very wrong. And no disrespect to whoever made it, because I'm sure they did the best they could, but it did not feel right.
No, but that's the thing. Those were the games of the time. Arcades and arcade games were really tough, and dying instantly.
Years, yeah. They wanted you to spend more money, so they had to kill you frequently enough to make sure that you had to pay more money if you wanted to progress.
Yeah, I'm interested in your testing of The Secret of Monkey Island. How did that go? Which bugs did you find? Which technical difficulties did you encounter with the testing of the first version?
Well, let's see. So when I started, I was not the first one on that. There were other people there who were much more experienced testers than I was. And so that I'll tell you a little bit more about kind of the philosophy of testing. But when we first played, you couldn't get past Melee Island. So it would kind of get to the end of Melee Island and like the game would kind of error out like, okay, there's no more game here. A lot of placeholder art, placeholder animations. So you had to kind of very quickly get used to understanding, like recognizing what is placeholder versus what is a bug. Because you might see art that doesn't look right. And it's like, well, is that because the art isn't there yet? Or is that because that's a bug? Some of it's also just getting used to the kinds of bugs that would typically come up in a SCUM engine game. So if things that were, every engine has its sort of things that it's good at, things that it's bad at, or things that it requires manual attention to get right. So you kind of get a sense of like, okay, this is, this kind of bug, or you'd pick up the lingo from somebody, you'd put in a bug report in the database and some of the programmers would reply to you and say, oh, it's a walkbox bug, where it's like, oh, walkboxes, I wonder what that is. And you kind of figure it out context. So it was a little bit sort of like a, kind of talking to the inscrutable databases. You didn't talk directly to the programmers too much. They're on a separate floor, but kind of by a conversation with them about bugs or seeing them talk to each other about bugs in the database, you would kind of get a sense of how things are put together. And so you kind of start to learn how the game's put together and kind of push on the weak parts. Like, oh, I bet if I try to pick this thing up again, I'll be able to. Like, oh, and I got 2 of those things. Classic bug. This is I'm trying to remember the guy's name. Jim. I'll remember his last name as soon as I stop talking. But Jim to me was like, he made the most heroic bug I've ever seen, and like aspirational in that field. He said, this is an example from Monkey 2. You can pick up a spit, right? You pick up spit. It's one of the things kids from your inventory. It turns out you can pick up spit from your own inventory again, and it duplicates it. And all of a sudden you've got multiple spits. And so initially it was like C bug. Like people might not encounter this unless they happen to do it. And then he upgraded the bug from C to A. He said if you pick up 255 spits, the game crashes. And to me, that's like the tester mentality of like, I've only got so much game to test. I know all the answers. I know all the dialogue. I know all the puzzles. I've seen all the animations. There's nothing new for me here. I have to make a game out of finding something that's wrong and pushing the edges and like, poking at the weak parts. And what Jim had done here was like, he had taken this bug and he said, well, I want to find the word, kind of have, there was not a kind of prize for it, but everyone was like looking for like, can you find the most A bugs, the most B bugs? It's like, I want to upgrade my bugs. And to have taken the bug that he'd found and not just say, okay, you can pick up multiple spits. That's a bug they're going to fix. But instead go to the point of like, I wonder how many I can do. And then having done it enough times, actually counted how many it was and kept track. Because you remember he was clicking. There's nothing in the game to keep track. He has to click and see how many times he has to click at the spit until it crashes. So he must have done multiple times. And so that, to me, I think gets to the heart of QA, which is that you're dealing with an incomplete game, which may have bugs that are known and unknown that you have to work around because they're not new things you're finding. You just have to keep working on the bug until it's fixed. And you're bored. Ultimately, QA can get very, very repetitive. I think for more modern games that are more open world, that's not the case because you're testing systems as opposed to testing content. But when you're testing content games, the content is fixed. It's finite, and you will get through it. You'll be used to it, and it's not novel or new. And so to keep yourself entertained, you have to imagine you're playing a different game, and the game is the find the bug game. And I think that's a key thing people misunderstand about game testing is they imagine, it must be great to get paid games all day. It's like, if you played Monkey Island, a fifth of Monkey Island, essentially, maybe more like a third of Monkey Island, and you had to play it all day, full time, for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, it's not as glamorous as you think. It's not like you play a game, you finish it, and they keep loading you into a new game. You're playing the same game. So I think that's something people misunderstand. But that's what it was like. It was like you would look at it and say, oh, yeah, that whole thing with the stump puzzle, there's something weird going on there that they haven't wired up. And, oh, this thing with the, behind the wall thing in the governor's mansion. They're doing something weird there they haven't quite decided on. It's not hooked up yet. But, press this button and then it says Guybrush gets X, gets the, whatever the wax lips or whatever. So I think that's a little bit what it's like. You do have a chance early on, I think, to influence things a little bit more in an adventure game simply because you can say this line doesn't make sense, or here's a better line for this description, or there's a missing description here. How about X? I think that's a nice thing, but you got to remember there are other games being tested in parallel. And again, this is a set of other games I tested really early on. Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe, right? Full flight sim, and very different way of testing that game. But that same tester, Jim, by the way, had bugs like if you fly under this bridge inverted, the game will crash. So he got to the point of like, okay, yeah, I can fly around. I'm going to fly down under a bridge, which why would you ever do that in a bombing game? I'm going to fly under this bridge, but it's not enough. I'm going to be flipped over and fly onto the bridge, and then it crashed. It's like, oh. And the reality is players aren't necessarily going to hit those bugs. But the very fact that you found them and you pushed on some limit in the engine or the process of creating the game that the programmers hadn't anticipated, and that they end up, fixing it, and then it usually fixes a whole class of other bugs. So, for example, you will never again be able to pick up something again from that's already in your inventory in Monkey 2 because Jim found that you could pick up spit multiple times, or turns out that their math fails when the plane's vector is pointing, up vector is pointing straight down or something like that. And once he found that, it probably fixed other things in the game that were causing weird crashes, during looping dogfights that nobody understood. Why would it crash at certain times? It's like, well, you had to be perfectly inverted and parallel to the ground. And that was only the case if you were flying inverted under a bridge because you had such a narrow tolerance. One of the things in Grim Fandango that was incredibly difficult to reproduce, these very edge conditions, was because of somebody. In this case, it wasn't them pushing on the edge, but it was like he was playing with a very unusual machine, and that found a bug that we had taken weeks to track down, but he was able to reproduce reliably. So I think that's the thing that QA gets a bad rap, and I think there's different kinds of QA now. So now there's like certification QA, which is more like does it conform to standards around PlayStation, which I'm partially responsible for, and that is not very glamorous testing at all. Does it use the right symbols? Does it throw up does it never show more than 3 seconds of black screen during loading or whatever, things like that. But yeah, I think at that time, at least, we as testers, were kind of turned loose, and I think LucasArts was a little bit advanced in that they had this bug database and they were tracking really and grading things really efficiently. And yeah.
So you encountered the stump. It wasn't a stump puzzle. It was a stump joke. Did you encounter the stump joke and told them, yeah, that's fine?
I think everybody was concerned that it was going to cause calls. We were all computer people. So for us, it was like, you're used to seeing error messages and you hit cancel and try again or whatever. But it was obvious that there were going to be people who were like, oh, I had to stop. I don't know what to do now. And what do I do? Oh, there's this number I'll call.
Well, it was very profitable for LucasArts because the hint line was like $1 a minute. So
I don't think that was intentional. By the way, I got to know those people really, really well. So Brandy and Terry Bratcher and I have some great stories from them because they have stories from the ranch because there were people there for a long time. But yeah, they always had these great stories from consumers calling in with weird questions and things. So those are good people to interview too.
So the stump joke was eventually removed. The first version of Monkey Island I played was the CD-ROM version, so I didn't see the stump joke because, first of all, they removed the stump joke from subsequent versions of Monkey Island because of the people calling customer service, and they removed it from the CD-ROM version because over there it didn't make any sense.
Yeah, I think about that. I think it's always, game developers have to be very careful not to be too clever and too meta. I always think of like Metal Gear Solid. There's the thing where, to Psycho Mantis, you have to like unplug the controller and plug it into the second port so that he can't anticipate. And I was like, first of all, I never played, like I heard about that after the fact. I'm like, how would you ever guess that, when you're breaking the expectations that everything's on the screen? And then second, like there were things about vibration and things like that where it's like, later versions of a console might not have vibrations because there's an ongoing lawsuit around vibration patents and things like that. So like weird things like that, where I think it's a mistake to ever kind of break out of the sort of, fourth wall is okay to address the player or the fact that it's a game, but like anything where you're referring to the hardware or the system, little sketchy. I think I was recently playing Inscription, and Inscription does some stuff with your file system, and I'm like, oh man, gotta watch this stuff because it's just so. Inscription kind of breaks a lot of conventions, but that kind of thing where it'll use like where it'll use a file name or ask you to name something or whatever. Always a little.
In Monkey Island 2, when you step on the ore in order to get up the tree, and so you get hit on the head by the ore, and then Guybrush enters a dream state. And then the background turns red, so Guybrush tells the audience not to try it and adjust their sets. So it's very different from insert disc number 22.
Yeah. I think that one's a little bit sort of more in keeping, especially because there's music starting up and it's still interacting with you. It's not hung up on your input. Like it's waiting for you to do something or fix something that, and you have to imagine how many errors of the time were completely inscrutable. And people, it was part of using computers is to get inscrutable errors and be nervous. Now, am I going to break something? Because often you could. So,
what was your to-do list when it came to testing adventure games? Because, you said that you're going to play the game from beginning to end, and then you're going to test various scenarios. But with adventure games, there are tons of scenarios that you could test. You could pick up objects in a different order every time, or try various dialogue options. See which one leads to the actual path you're trying to go to, or maybe it reaches a dead end and you're not aware of it. So how can you be sure that you covered all of the possible options, or you just wing it?
I think there are certain things that you can definitely anticipate in advance. So, for example, use every object with every other object, and not just this object with
we
that
did it
object,
as well.
that object with this object, right? In reverse. Those kind of things you can kind of make a spreadsheet and just assign to somebody and say, you're going to go do all these. The dialogue, I think, meant paying a lot more attention, especially if there's dialogue where some earlier conversation might be referenced later. You have to be very careful about those. Those are a little bit more wing it, especially because a lot of the dialogue was changing throughout development and gets locked down pretty late as they come up with new things there, new jokes they want to put in, or new dialogue branches. What was the other one? Oh, the everything having a line for every verb and every object, right? That's a combinatorial thing as well, where it's like, these are opportunities for jokes and the default line sucks. Like if you, my least favorite dialogue line, and I think the worst failure of voice direction in any game I saw at LucasArts was the default line for Sam and Max. There's something where it's like, if you do something, there's some default line where Sam says something and Max says something like, I don't know where I am, Sam. And then the guy said the line wrong is like, I don't know where I am, Sam, or something like that. And it's just like, it's a really badly, like they clearly, like, the two actors were not in the same room or didn't have the right context for the joke. And it was a default line where if there wasn't a joke, that's what you would hear. And I think that is something where these games, part of the magic comes from the richness of, like, feeling like everything had been, not that everything had been thought of, but that somebody had taken the care to reward exploring with a custom line. I think it's a really important thing. So yeah, that was one thing, something you could put in a test plan to say, like, make sure everything's got a custom line, which things don't. And they wouldn't necessarily.
And did you test out all of the verbs? All of the verbs on any object in your inventory and on every object on the screen?
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, if you're going to play for 40 hours a week for weeks on end, then, there's going to be time for that. Other than that, let's see, what kinds of things would you do? I think trying to find, like, a lot of things are like entering a room and then immediately leaving, or entering and leaving a room a lot, because you're trying to stress the asset loading in the game engine and find things that'll break or interrupt lines. You're going to try and find very common in the Scum engine. Escaping cutscenes does not stop an animation. So you could because the way, and that, like I said, there are some things that have to be taken care of by the scripters. Scum engine was very poor at saying, like, hey, when the cutscene is over, stop any custom animation playing and go back to this set of animations or whatever. And so, like, on Assessing Fate of Atlantis, there was the wrong set of animations would get restored. So, for example, there was a thing where you were crawling into a torpedo tube and crawling back out in the submarine. And if you escape the cutscene in there, Indy's walk animation would be replaced with his talk animation, where he kind of gestures like this and kind of does this. Mm-hmm. And just the way that the animation system worked, it was kind of playing a fixed loop as it went left and right. And so Indy would kind of ski around with his hands on his hips, like he would be in the conversation. Then he's supposed to periodically go like this. And so there was this point where he would ski past Sophia, kind of with his hands out. And then right before he reached Sophia, he would kind of go, like put his hands out like he was going to grab Sophia. And so, like, really funny bugs like that. But those are things where, and the Grim Fandango also had this issue, which is that, there's a lot of custom code that goes around these dialogues and these cutscenes and the dialogue trees. And, the notion that there has to be not just that they have to play and look right, but also if they get interrupted, that they go back, to some state. And so I think later we had things like, push, like a stack of these things, and then you're going to pop everything back to the start of the scene. But at the time, it wasn't like that. It's all very sort of loose and kind of manual. I even just saw recently a friend of mine asked about getting into writing in games, and I was like, well, we always thought there should be a tool for writing these branching dialog trees, but whenever I saw it in any kind of Scum or Lua code, it was always like just handwritten code, and there wasn't a tool for doing these things or testing dead paths or whatever, or rehearse or debugging them or whatever. And turns out there are now. Like I went looking for her, and it's like, oh, it turns out this is something that people now understand needs to exist in the world. And so there's these tools for dialogue trees in text adventures or Unity or Unreal, and they're commercial tools for it. And I was really surprised and happy to see that had advanced.
And you tested the Macintosh versions of Monkey 1 and Monkey 2 as well. Did you get to test the FM Towns version of Monkey 2?
I did not. So the way things worked with my career is that I ended up working for a summer job, commuting 50 miles each way, and basically spending my hourly salary in gas money. So I basically made almost no money. That was one summer, and then I was testing again between my senior year of high school and my first year of college. And because of that, I kind of missed the school year worth of development. And so I came into Monkey 2 pretty late. And then I was back at school again. And so I think I kind of got a brief window in those 2 summers of places in their development. I don't think I ever saw the FM Towns version of Monkey 1 or 2.
Well, the FM Towns version of Monkey 2 is notorious for having a bug that I constantly ask LucasArts and people about, in which they removed the scene in which Guybrush uses the fishing pole to get the map piece from the cliff. And so there's vertical scrolling in that scene. And so that vertical scrolling was apparently the culprit in that particular scene. So that scene is removed.
Interesting. So you interviewed Eric Willender, so you've probably heard about all the vertical scrolling stuff with the dig.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the kind of thing that, when this is maybe for later in the conversation, but for Grim Fandango, when I was choosing not to use Scum, there were a lot of things like that were starting to get hard to work around. Like, the notion that Scum was really optimized for horizontal scrolling, only decompressing one little strip at a time, falls apart when you go vertical, but also it doesn't make sense when you're trying to put camera angles in weird places, and all the walk boxes are aimed at scaling in screen space rather than camera space. But yeah, that does make sense to me, that the vertical scrolling would have been a problem there. I never saw it, but I definitely heard about it after the fact with the dig.
Now, moving on to Fate of Atlantis, you started talking about the D and E bugs. Now, if I'm not mistaken, you're the sole tester on Fate of Atlantis for months. So you are the only one who knew all of the D and E and A, B, and C bugs.
Yep.
From the beginning of the production until which point in the production?
I want to say I went back to school. I think at that point they were putting other testers on it. Let's see. Wayne Klein came over. So I think Swaddle wrapped up. I think your Secret Weapons wrapped up, and the Swaddle testers started to come over onto Indy. So I wasn't great at testing Swaddle, by the way. I was a terrible tester for Swaddle. I described how Jem was so great at finding those things. I was not. I was not even a very good flight simulator player. So as a player, I was like, can I even finish the mission? It's a miracle. And I eventually got really depressed, and I was playing the same mission over and over, trying to just do it more optimally. But that was not finding many bugs. Anyway, I got moved over onto Indy Fate of Atlantis. And then those folks, when Swaddle wrapped up, they started to move over. But yeah, I had a good month or two solo. Got to know Hal a little bit. You got to understand at that time that because the programmers were all kind of on the second floor and we were all on the first floor in what was called the testing pit, which is like this room in the center of the building that had no windows in it. Got very sweaty and very, very hot. So we didn't see the programmers very often. And when they did, it usually meant that there was, they needed to come down for us to show us something, like prove that you can do this thing. And so if you saw them, it usually meant you were kind of on deck to, not waste their time. And they seem crabby. But I got to know Hal around then. And he seemed like a very nice guy, and later found out he was, and he came back and worked as a programmer years later, got to know him a little better. Very nice guy. But yeah, I had kind of I was the sole QA person on Indie, kind of from first playable builds. And like I said, they still had a lot of stuff going on. I think they were also kind of working with like, what is the humor in this game? Because they wanted it to be sort of, good for people who knew indie but didn't know adventure games, but not so jokey, and sort of keeping with the culture of the other games. There's definitely a running sense of humor across these games that they didn't want to overdo on indie. So there's a little bit of that.
So what were the D&E bugs in Fate of Atlantis?
I'd have to pull them out, but I think a lot of it was that early cutscene stuff, the early opening of the game stuff. That game was notorious for having the fists and wits and the other path stuff. I think I had some suggestions around that to make it clear what path you were on. I have to go look it up. I have that list somewhere here in the house. Actually, I printed it out before I left. I'm like, okay, here's all my contributions, that some of which were totally ignored, but I think I used it in a later job interview to say like, hey, I have design ideas too, and here's some examples or whatever.
Well, you got your 40 hours of gameplay by having to test all 3 paths, and
that's true. Yeah. I was not a fan of the fist path though. It felt out of place. It felt very much like that arcade game for Last Crusade.
Well, at least you had you could press 0 on the numpad.
Yeah, skip fight.
And win instantly.
Win button.
Mm-hmm.
If you have to have a win button in your game, maybe something's wrong.
Well, after the feedback from Last Crusade, they added win buttons to all of the LucasArts action scenes. You have one for full throttle. You have Control W, and you can skip the bike fights and the demolition derby. Basically everything.
Yeah, I don't think I knew about that the time that I played them.
Now you do.
I was very, very frustrated. I might have skipped the clam bake scene.
So you also tested the Sega CD version of Secret of Monkey Island, right?
Oh, I don't remember.
You're credited on it.
So here's the thing. I might have credits because I think for Monkey Island, they carried forward a lot of the credits into the ports. So I suspect I did not test that one, but I got a credit in it, just like I've got a credit in some of the remastered stuff.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting because usually testing credits don't move between ports because you need to test each port from scratch. You can't base it on the fact that
they usually have like, Sega CD version tested by X, but they usually keep the original testers in there. At least that's what I've seen in the Monkey Island ports.
And do you know how you're credited on the Monkey 2 credits?
I think Monkey 2, I don't know. Monkey 1, I know it's additional testing by.
No, Monkey 2 is additional testing by Egg.
Does it say Egg?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say Bret Mogilefsky?
It says additional testing by Egg.
Oh, that's funny. So what's funny about that is that the person who was kind of my liaison, they needed some additional testing help, and I was in my first year of college, and so they brought a version out for me to test in the dorms, which was probably unwise because, unreleased game in the dorms at Berkeley. But anyway, the person who brought it out was Terry Bratcher in the Hinline department. And Terry always called me Egg. Like for him, I was always Egg. I will always be Egg. Like that nickname stuck with him more than anyone else. So it's just funny because it might have been him that was actually assembling the credits and put it in there. I had no idea.
So it seems that in the DOS version, you're credited for additional testing by, but in subsequent versions, you have the Macintosh version, additional testing by Egg. In the special edition, additional testing by Egg.
I had no idea. How funny.
And so between
you are very
Monkey between Monkey 1 Sega CD, which was in 1993, around 1993, and 1997, in which you're credited on dark forces too.
Is it?
What happened in those 4 years?
I went to college. So yeah, you got to remember this QA job was a summer job for me. And I went to school. I had never anticipated that I would ever be in games full time. It was always going to be a summer job. I went to Berkeley. UC Berkeley lived, it's kind of midway between, where I live in Fremont and where LucasArts is, or Lucasfilm was in Marin. And so I went to UC Berkeley, and I tried to resist the siren call of computers and tell myself that I was going to be this liberal arts and do something. Who knows what I'm going to do? But it was always going to be computer science. Always going to be computers. So I went there. I ended up with 2 degrees. I got a computer science degree and a applied math degree. And the computer science degree, Berkeley offered, actually, I think they still do. They offered 2 different computer science degrees. So one is in the College of Engineering and one is in the College of Letters and Science. And the engineering is all the hardcore one. Like that's where all the hardware engineers were. I was not a hardware person. I've always been a software person. So, but the College of Letters and Science was a little bit more free form. You could do a lot more sort of elective kind of, not necessarily computer sciencey courses and still get this computer science degree. So it was a good fit for the math degree as well. I was doing both at the same time. Yeah, and I had a wild and crazy time at Berkeley. Really interesting, the set of people and technology that came out of that time. Linux burst onto the scene while I was at school for very first versions of the Linux kernel being some academic project by this guy named Linus Torvalds. And so downloading that and trying to make it work on my PC at home so that I wouldn't have to fight for time in the computer labs. The first 3D hardware. So we had, silicon graphics, high-end machines were in this special lab. You could use the SGI machines, but nobody knew how to use them. And there weren't a lot of computer graphics courses. There was one computer graphics course, and so the first thing I made that looked anything like an actual game was my final project in that course. But there are other things that came out of there. Things, if you're familiar with Linux, the GNOME desktop environment, GDK, GTK, all came out of there. The GIMP, the GNU image manipulation, the graphics editor, all came out of this group called the XCF, the Experimental Computing Facility, which was a rival student group with the one that I was in, which was the Computer Science Undergrad Association. It was a lot of really smart people, and a lot of really interesting stuff came out of there. The computer graphics course, I think, was a special interest to me because I'd done the math degree, and so I did a lot of linear algebra, which is really fun. Linear algebra is just fun. And computer graphics uses linear algebra, and it's a very tiny subset of the math, but used for rotations and translations and kinds of dot products and things like that. But closest thing to games, again, I was still kind of under the illusion that I was not going to go back into games, that like I was a serious computer science person, and that games are for
kids.
Games are for they're not just for kids. It's that games are made by street hackers. Those are those untrained, unwashed. I'm an elite university at this computer science degree at Berkeley, and that's surely beneath me. Those street hacker skills, those will never work in the real world. That's only for games. There's sort of a snobbery there that I definitely was trying to kind of deny my own kind of bet toward that stuff. Yeah, I remember the first thing that, it's funny because it ended up being embarrassing during my interview, but Computer Science 184 is the graphics course at Berkeley. And, you go through writing your rasterizer, writing, a wireframe renderer from scratch. And you kind of switch partners. Most amazing course I had, because you switch partners every 2 weeks. And then you have to decide which partner's code you're going to throw away and which one you're going to keep building on, which is a really amazing way.
It actually prepares you for real life.
Exactly. It was great. It was like working with people, getting out of brass tacks, comparing code quality, having real conversations about that. making decisions, and then tackling a new problem with your existing code base. So it was great. And then the last 2 weeks we were given to like make a project of your own. And a lot of people try to make games of various sorts. And so I got together with a couple of friends and we made a game called At Attack. And we made, because we wanted to show they want us to show animation, and they want us to show, like, you could choose, like, you know, your project must show 2 of these 4 things or whatever. And so I wanted to make, we made this thing where the battle, it was inspired by Battle of Hoth and Empire Strikes Back. And the idea was that you start out as AT-ATs at opposite ends of an arena. And then when you take enough damage, you become an ATST and you can move a lot faster and kind of run around the other one. And if you take enough damage, then your head kind of breaks off and you become a snowspeeder and you kind of fly around and you're more maneuverable and can go up and things like that. And, you know, I think this is maybe a theme for my career, if there's any, which is that you'll take on wild things if you don't know how hard they are. And sometimes you succeed. And that was one of the things where it's like, we only had 2 weeks to do this and we had to like model an AT-AT and make an animation cycle for it. We didn't have a modeler. We didn't have animation tools. And so it was literally like with graph paper, you know, in one class, in limited time in the computer labs, I would write on graph paper, like, okay, I'm going to make this hexagon or this octagon. And I make this octagon prism. I'm going to use it for the bottom of the feet and for each knee joint. And, you know, and this head, I'm going to make it so that if I flatten the head, it looks like a snowspeeder. But if it's not flat, it looks like the head of an AT-AT. And so like this idea of like kind of modeling it on graph paper and writing out the coordinates, what they would be, different, you know, orthographic kind of views. And, you know, people got excited when I go to the labs and like I'd be sitting there entering numbers for a half hour. And then all of a sudden I'd try and run it. And all of a sudden, you know, something that was very clearly an AT-AT leg would appear on the screen and start moving. And we did all that as well as actually put together, you know, controls for the game and even a little radar scope to show you where's the other player in case you lose track of them. And it was pretty impressive. I mean, it wasn't a good game by any means. It wasn't fun. And it didn't look all that impressive, but it was impressive for like having been 2 weeks of work by 3 students who barely had been doing anything in 3D at the start of the semester. So that's on a floppy disk somewhere, which I'll dig out and manage to recover before it rots. But it came up in my interview with LucasArts. So like, have you ever worked on a game before? And I was embarrassed. First, because I thought it would be way too fanboy to say that I worked on a game that had anything to do with Star Wars, or I thought that I would get in trouble with it because I didn't know what I was allowed to do or not allowed to do.
And it would have sued you.
And they would have sued me. But also because I was embarrassed. I was like, oh, it's not a good game. It doesn't look great. But it was like, no, at the time, like it was making a 3D game with, you know, flight dynamics and animation, you know, hand modeled models and hand calculated animations and all these kinds of things. It was actually really a lot of work, and I should have been very proud of it. But I was just embarrassed. I was just shy, and they had to kind of drag it out of me in the interview, which I think some of them liked. They like, I don't know. Ray Gresco interviewed me. One of the main programmers I'm sure you've heard on Dark Forces and Jedi Knight. Genius guy, and he kind of had this kind of shit-eating grin on his face when he pulled it out of me. He's like, you know, there's something about it. Like I was, and it was so dumb. I was so naive to think that like, no, I should use every advantage I have to get this job if I want a job. But I didn't want to refer to it. I was embarrassed by it. Didn't want to come across as, you know, such a fanboy.
So when were you rehired exactly?
So I was getting close to graduation. And I was still under the impression that I was not going to go there. And I stopped by for lunch with somebody or something like that. And I saw Tim Schafer. I got to know Tim when he was working on Monkey 1 and 2. And he saw me in the parking lot. I was like, oh, I haven't seen you in a long time. And he was looking in the back of my car because I was just driving down the parking lot. And he's like, what is that? In the back of the car, I had this towel over like this elaborate breadboard thing. I told you I'm not a hardware person, but I'd like across the back seat, there were like 3 different breadboard trying to do this stupid hardware project, total nightmare. And he was like, oh, wow, you're actually learning this stuff. He's like, yeah. I'm like, yeah. He's like, can you code? I'm like, yeah, I can code. And I told him a little bit about, you know, graphics course. And he's like, you should apply. I was like, well, okay. And so you get to a point where it's like, and again, this is, I talked earlier about like you find a job by calling a hint line or you calling a corporate line listening for a recording. It wasn't much better coming out of school. You kind of had to just kind of randomly fire resumes to different places and hope you got interviewed. But yeah, I sent a resume to LucasArts and, I didn't send it directly to Tim's attention or anything, but they interviewed me and I don't know how much, I don't know what their applicant pool looked like. I have no idea at the time, but I got a phone call and they did like a phone screen. The first phone screen was a person named Darren Stinnett, who was the lead on Outlaws, which was all starting up around the same time as Grim Fandango. And he had this question, which I later learned was supposed to be just like a weeder question, like a really simple one. He said, you need to draw a one-dimensional line on the screen. Like you just need to draw like a horizontal line. Like, what would the code look like to do that? And it's an interesting question because number one, it says, can you program at all? But number two, it's also like, what do you know about hardware and what do you know about, graphics chips, things like that. And I didn't know much, honestly, about like, at that time, I assumed like, people who've been programming DOS know all about all these interrupts and, all these different modes they can put the graphics hardware in. I didn't know any of that stuff. I was sort of ivory tower, SGI machine or my own software renderer. And I'm kind of proud of this now because I thought about it really hard. And he was like I was kind of freezing up. There's a phone interview. It's like, are you still there? I'm like, yeah. I'm just trying to think about the best way to do it. And he's like, well, just talk it through. And it's like, okay. And I actually made up something on the fly, which turned out to be really clever. So in a C, there's a switch statement, right? You can do a switch and a break. And I knew the bare minimum about loop unrolling, which is anybody who's ever done any kind of optimization will tell you about loop unrolling. But the idea that like you're gonna loop for a certain number of pixels and then stop is like, well, I want to write as many pixels at once as I can, and so I'm going to put in 8 pixels per loop if I can, and then only deal with the individual ones if I have to. And I wrote what is I now know is called Duff's device. This guy named Tom Duff at ILM invented it. And it's an optimization about loop unrolling using C, where it's like you don't have to go to assembly, but you can actually sort of abuse how a C compiler compiles a switch statement down to assembly to essentially do loop unrolling from the C code that shows up in the assembly code. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of reinvented independently invented, I'll say, Duff's device on the phone. And I didn't find out until later that it actually had a name and that it was actually this technique this person had come up with. But apparently that really impressed him. So that got me through the screen. And I heard later that no, that was supposed to be a really simple question and you were going to all the way to the other side of it, which is the optimization side, which I did out of pure panic and nervousness rather than any real kind of acumen. So that was my weird question. And then I was brought in to interview. A lot of people from Jedi Knight team interviewed me, Darren's team. And Tim didn't have any programmers at the time for Grim Fandango, so I think he was relying on them. But I guess I impressed Ray enough. Rob Hubner as well and the Jedi Knight team were good folks. And they saw whatever potential, even though I had only ever done this, 2-week project in my graphics class. You got to keep in mind, I had never programmed on Windows or even DOS. All my programming knowledge came from like learning on big Unix machines at Berkeley or trying to make Linux run on my PC. I never made a commercial game. My history was as QA and doing sort of computer science and linear algebra, but not things that I thought were critical to game development at the time. And as it turned out, that was a transitory and sort of the end of an era of the sort of DOS mode.
You were in college when the FMV genre started and ended in 93 till 97.
True.
Windows 95 was released some way midway.
Yeah, suddenly you're not programming directly on registers.
Exactly.
So it kind of worked out for me that way.
You went to college. The world was very different than the one that you came out to on the other end.
And I got lucky in that sense, in that it turned out that exactly what people needed were people who had done 3D and linear algebra and like, oh, we have this new hardware coming up, or, oh, you know how to optimize rasters or whatever, turned out to be a useful skill that games had not been able to even, think about as a viable thing until then. So.
Now, in 97, you were credited on 2 games. The first one is The Curse of Monkey Island, in which you get the first of many special thanks. Somehow you got tons of special thanks credits all across the board. What was your contribution to the project, if any?
I don't know. I was a cheerleader as part of it. Special thanks is, no. So when I started, they gave me a choice of games to work on, and the games were basically Outlaws or Grim Fandango. And Outlaws, they were, trying to draw me with the idea that this is going to be sort of FPS and, kind of fast paced, and that would be good fun. But Grim Fandango was, adventure games are kind of my heart. And there was nobody on that. So I kind of got to get in early on that one and put more of a stamp on that one. But because Grim Fandango was going to be an adventure game, initially the notion was that it was going to be based on Scum, which going to use the Scum engine. And so they had me, when I joined, go through what they call Scum U, right? Scum University. So when I first started, I was learning, I was doing this 2 or 3 day course with Chuck Jordan, who you should probably interview at some point, various other people, working with Jonathan Ackley when they were starting at Curse of Monkey Island. So I was very close with that team. Chris Purvis also worked on that team. Had come up from QA, so he and I always had a lot in common. But yeah, I don't know if I ever actually put any code in Curse of Monkey Island, I think.
And the second game you're credited on in 1997 is Dark Forces 2, in which you're credited for game programming, additional tools programming.
Dark Forces, well, for Jedi Knight, right? Not
yep,
Dark Forces.
Jedi Knight, Dark Forces 2.
Yeah. No, so there's a lot more to say there. So this was a period in the company where the first real push for reuse was happening as the game engines got more complex. So my office mate when I first joined was Aaron Giles, who've been interviewed. Aaron Giles, brilliant guy. Obviously, emulation whiz, but had come from the Mac and then Mac, in unofficial Mac ports to PowerPC, and then had come into the company. And he had been really focused on like, well, can you do these things to make the Mac ports easier for me? If y'all could just like use a macro for byte order when you're loading stuff from files, that would make it much easier for me to port this stuff. But he had also gone to the point of like modularity, like, okay, dependency injection. Every library we make, can we just settle that for every single library, you're going to take a little structure which says, here's how to allocate memory, like use this to allocate memory rather than writing your own memory allocator, and use this to, hook into sound, or use this to get into your graphics buffer. And so he made the first sort of push toward modularity, and that enabled a lot of reuse across these game engines. So the Jedi Knight team, the Outlaws team was essentially iterating on the Dark Forces engine. The Jedi Knight team was doing a full 3D engine. And I think the Insane engine, which is what they use for Rebel Assault, and all the pieces that Vince Lee wrote for that, they were just getting to the point where all of them had, and I'm used as well, all of them had like this init structure where you pass in a structure that you could have a common memory allocator across all of them, or a common reference to the frame buffer, or a common reference to how to make a sound. And so I came in right at the right time, and I didn't know anything. I didn't know how to make a game. But here were all these game engines where they had all these interesting libraries and pieces that did things that I needed, and that I could start putting them together. And that also meant that when I started using them, it was the first time they had real reuse. It also meant that I was in a position to contribute back. So when you see additional programming on tools and things for Jedi Knight, that's about me finding bugs or adding functionality and pushing it back upstream to them. I also went to great lengths to really work on version control. Version control was terrible in early game companies, and there's still a lot of source that's lost as a result, but a lot of, merge by hand from this floppy to that floppy, or what's the golden, which is the golden machine that has the version that we all treat as the real one. I worked very hard with the Jedi Knight team on Visual Source Safe, which was the best of the bad options for version control on Windows, which would eat, we called it source unsafe, as most people did, because it would periodically eat your code base. But at the very least, it allowed us to have branches, and I could check instantly to a branch and then merge it with somebody else. Very primitive compared to anything like Git, but the best option we had. And I would take changes from them upstream, and I would push some changes back on things like RenderDroid, which is the software rasterizer, IMUSE. So I kind of became, by being somebody who was so new to all this stuff, I had a very, very, and this is something I think I've kept through all my career. I'm not interested in making the bits collide. I'm interested in making the game go. And to some extent, that means that if there's a thing I can use, or there's a platform or an engine that can be reused, or same thing now when I'm looking at open source, if there's something, I don't want to solve problems that have already been solved if I can. And so I'm always looking to collaborate and send people pull requests upstream or whatever. And I think I was at this point where Grim Fandango is kind of a stone soup engine, where I pick a piece from here, a piece from there, a piece from there. It's this text rendering library that Aaron wrote for this, and RenderDroid from or Leia from Jedi Knight. The RenderDroid's the rasterizer, and Leia was the level editing tool. Animation tools from Jedi. I was piecing things together because I didn't know how to write any of that stuff. But I also learned by taking them apart. So by using them and then finding something it didn't do that I wanted it to do, and then figuring out how it worked, and then adding the code, it was a really good way to learn. So if I have special thanks credits around that time, partially it's because I was contributing back to these things that I was getting to use and learn from. So I got really lucky that way.
And did the playtester in you ever kick in during your development years, or?
I mean, I was always
once you go developer, you never go back.
Oh no. I always had the testing mindset. We weren't. It's not like modern software development where there was test frameworks all over the place. And I know Double Fine, a friend of mine, worked there, Paul Dubois. He was oh, we got a fuzzer bot that basically just we made the whole game. It just runs around the game world and tries things, and it finds bugs all the time. I was wow, that's amazing. I think that I kept the background of coming from testing of how will this break, or what are people going to try? But I don't think it necessarily. I don't think it really went into how I contributed to these other libraries I was using. It did contribute to how the relationship I had with the test department, which I think at that point, the company grown quite a bit during the intervening years while I was at college. And there were some people who really looked down on the testing pit, and the testing pit had sort of, internalized sense of well, we're in the basement, and, we're kind of this spaceless mass. I always had a really good relationship with my assigned test lead and the people who worked on the game. And Chris Purvis had come up from test, to work on Grim and Crystal McAllen. I had a really good relationship with the people. I don't know that I would say no. For me, when I used something, it was I would use it until I reached the edge of its capabilities. It wasn't the same as it breaking, but as example, the Jedi Knight rasterizer was 8-bit. It assumed that every level had 256 color palette. And that palette had a certain number of colors that were reserved for Kyle Katarn and laser blasts and things like that were used on every level. And the rest was a palette for the entire level. And I only had to render out one background for Grim Fandango to recognize that, no, there was no way we can palletize this game and have it look like we want it to. And so then it became, well, okay, so how do I make the Jedi Knight rasterizer not 8-bit? How do I make it 16-bit? So that I can actually have 16-bit colors. It's, now I'm doing 16-bit color. I got to figure out, 16-bit color is a terrible color format, because it's Is it 565? Is it 555? Is it 655? Because the number of bits per red, green, and blue channel makes a difference. It's like, oh, do I want it to be higher, more shades of blue or more shades of red? And then later hardware comes into it. It's like, oh, this graphics card doesn't support that format. So we have to convert everything when we're loading it. And so that comes back to like, okay, so now let's figure out, I'm going to help them change the layout of the rasterizers in Jedi Knight. Ray Gresko had blown out his wrists doing all the assembly for that. And we were going to have to write these 16-bit rasterizers. So I worked with another guy named Steve Ash, a very sweet person, worked on Outlaws, but he had some time. And so he helped me, and we worked on doing 16-bit rasterizers and then contributed back to RenderDroid. And I don't know if that ever actually got used for Jedi Knight or I think it got used for Mysteries of the Sith. I'm not sure. But that's the kind of thing I did, where it's like, find what it won't do that I needed to. It's like, oh, if only it did X, and then try to do it in a way that they would accept it as if they'd done it themselves, kind of follow their example. Jedi Knight team was very, very good people to learn from. They were very sort of, highly structured in the way they approach things and very professional, and it was good.
Eventually the Sith engine was used for Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine.
Correct. And Gary Brubaker had to adapt it there. That was an interesting one. I was almost on that game. Gary had this amazing, it's just really interesting. That whole period of like 3D game engine innovation at that time, and like the small things that we take for granted. Like at the time, the BSP plane was everything, because that's how Carmack did it, and it was amazing. But there was this thing with for determining visibility in Jedi Knight, where it's like it was all sectors. It was all the way the Sith engine was put together. It was all sectors, volumes, and it was kind of projecting rays through sectors, and like had a tree of sectors and would stop. And the Indiana Jones game, they wanted to have this more open environments, which meant that there were a lot more sectors. You could see everything from everything else. And so the visibility algorithm blew up, and where Gary had this idea of memoization.
And you could actually see Indy.
You could see Indy, yes. And he had this idea of memoization. So he fixed the algorithm such that it wasn't trying to do like n by n. It was trying to do n, it took a exploding algorithm, made it linear or something like that. But yeah, that engine had a lot of teeth, and this is because at this period they started to look at reuse a lot. So the idea that you could take the Dark Forces engine and use it for Outlaws, the idea that you could take the Sith engine, I cannibalized it for Grimm, but they also used it for Mysteries of the Sith and that Indiana Jones game. We stopped throwing things away. There had been other game engines, especially to try and replace Scum, and that's a story in and of itself, that had not gone very well. But this is the first point in time where people were starting to recognize their game engines as collections of components that could be useful in and of themselves, and actually put forth the minimum effort to make it usable by other people without rewriting everything. And I think that's where Aaron was really successful, and then I benefited quite a lot. And again, I shared an office with him, so it was like, I could ask him
with Aaron Giles.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Aaron, when I started, I was in the same office with Aaron, and see, I'm remembering all the names now. Whaley Sow, she worked on Leia a little bit. We had to adapt Leia, which is the level editor from Jedi Knight, because we wanted to lay out the areas that Manny would walk in Grim Fandango the same way. But whereas they were laying out whole levels, we were just laying out like just the places, the flat places that, kind of surfaces that Manny was allowed to walk on. But yeah, I worked with, a lot of people around that same time. We were still a very small company in the end. Programming staff wasn't huge. So yeah, a lot of other people you've interviewed, like.
Now, you're the first person I interviewed that worked on Grim Fandango. Usually the people I interview worked on things like Curse of Monkey Island around that time. And I always asked them if they knew at the time that Curse would be the last Scum game. I mean, the Scum engine has showed its age for several years at that point. But it seems that Curse was... they still tweaked Scum because Curse was the first game that used the 640 by 480.
Double size, yeah.
So,
say double res.
So it seemed that they keep upgrading the engine. So I'm not sure if they knew that it would be the last game. If it was a worthwhile effort to actually upgrade it for 640 by 480, given that it would be the last game. So I always ask them if they knew that it would be the last game. So you coming from Grim Fandango, were you aware that 2D was dead at that point?
No, not at all. So my manager was Eric Wolmander, who, as you will know, was known as he had taken on the title of Scumlord. Basically, there was always a keeper of the Scum engine. And between Eric and Vince Lee, they had done a lot of upgrades to that engine over the years for the ports to different systems, or ports from DOS to Windows, or EGA to VGA and Talkie, like all the different things that Scum had been through over the years, and sort of constantly reinventing and adapting, either for ports or for new games. And there was no sign that would end. And like I said, you have to remember that there were other adventure game systems that had come up in the interim that had failed. So, for example, the cutscene engine for the X-Wing and TIE Fighter games was StoryDroid, I think it was called. StoryDroid was intended to replace Scum originally. It was like, oh, we're going to make this cutscene engine for this game, and just going to be so good you're going to want to use it instead of Scum because it's all modern and has all these things. And we're incorporating to other game types and so on. Did not happen. I think there was another effort. Steve Shaw, who was on Outlaws, you'd have to interview him, but Steve was trying to make another engine around the time that they, let's see, for Full Throttle, before they sort of mashed the Insane engine into the Scum engine for these sort of full motion video sequences. There was a new engine he was working on around that time that also didn't work out. I can't remember the name of it. And I think that at the time it had basically been like, well, you think you're going to replace Scum, but you're not going to, because it's harder than you think. And there was a series of attempts to replace Scum that had failed. And Scum, meanwhile, had adapted and had this incredible pedigree of all these games shipped on it. So like, why would you ever do that? And the answer was because you didn't know what you were doing, because you were me and you were taking on something really ambitious and were willing to also, to make that happen, make a stone soup out of all these other 3D game engines instead of trying to adapt Scum. And I think I broke Eric's heart a little bit. I remember the conversation with him where I was like, look, I'm looking at what I need to do to adapt Scum to make this happen, and I don't know if it's worth it. Like, because the adaptations I was looking at were things like, Tim really, really wanted to do, it's like, we're going to have 3D characters. I want to be able to look up from their feet. I want to look down on them from above. I want to be able to, look at them from really far away. And the Scum engine at its heart was still a 2D engine with fixed point. It didn't have floating point. It didn't even have, so you're talking about 3D coordinates. If you move too far away, people would start skipping in, huge gaps because it was fixed point. And that was, a legacy of it being ported to a million systems that didn't have good floating point at the time. Or palletization deeply built into the game engine. And the notion, again, that like you're going to shade these characters, and you have lighting and shading and all these backgrounds with all this lighting and shading in them, and you have lots of rich backgrounds, and you're going to palletize that down somehow. And it was never going to work. And I remember walking to Eric's office. It was he stayed late. I was always stay late. I said, I think I'm going to try and go without Scum. And he kind of did this. Kind of like this, like he just kind of like, he wasn't going to dissuade me because he'd had this conversation with like 3 different programmers at this point who had tried to replace Scum. And he kind of was just going to say, I'm not going to stop you. But there was this sort of, I'm unspoken, later, like, I am going to wait for it to fail because that's never worked out. And like, you'll be back kind of thing. And it was really hard because, he was my boss and, it'd been very hands off, but I did feel like I was kind of, kicking dirt on the legacy. And I didn't like that. But on the other hand, I was like trying to put together this demo for Grim Fandango. And I was like, well, if I do this for Scum, I'm going to have to like strip it down to nothing and like figure out how to rebuild it from scratch. Or I could take these pieces from Jedi Knight, add a text renderer, and this other thing I needed, which was screen space costumes, and have something working. And so the demo I did that. It was basically, it was a, what was it? I needed to show like, this is like there were two sort of major demos for Grim Fandango. One was this one, which was just showing that I could put text on the screen, showing that I could show 3D characters clipping behind pre-rendered assets. So that's the Z buffer, like, going behind a desk kind of thing. And also animate a 2D thing on screen. And I think I had the bulldog animation from Full Throttle, the run animation of that dog. And it basically, the first demo was just the best. All it was just technical of like, all these elements are now drivable on screen. Start here. And basically saying, what are we missing from Scum? And at that point, it was scripting language. That was it. That was all it was missing. And so it was like, okay, I feel like I can solve the scripting language hole as long as I have all these other nice libraries that do these other things that I'm pulling from, 3 other games. Back to your question about Curse. I don't know. I mean, honestly, I think there's a lot to recommend the notion that, like, the Saturday morning cartoons or more animation style, like the same way you'd have in film, coming into games was just sort of naturally where things were always going to go. And Scum had always been very successful based on people like Steve Purcell doing these amazing backgrounds with very limited palette and very limited screen resolution, just making the best use of every pixel he had. And same thing with Larry and all these character animations and so on, and Bill Tiller in the background. They've done a great job. And so the notion that was going to stop, I think, was not in the cards. I don't think people. And let's be clear, like the Grim Fandango, the cost per animation for Grim Fandango is probably a lot higher than it was for any of the 2D games, because you had
that was one of my next questions.
Yeah, you had to deal with 3D.
Because they always said that the switch at that point, switching to 3D was cheaper because you make one model and then you can change the camera angles, while staying in 2D with these high resolutions would require highly detailed animations and lots of frames, things that they didn't have to do back in the day with Monkey 1 and Monkey 2, in which the characters were really small and the animations were pretty basic.
Yes.
But Grim Fandango cost $3 million, and I doubt that Curse cost anywhere around that figure.
Well, Grim was big, and we did invent a lot of stuff along the way to make it work. I do think people are right, and that fundamental thing of like, well, if I want to do a top-down scene of Guybrush, I gotta go draw a top-down scene of Guybrush. Where if it's Grim, I just move the camera and I can render it. It's fine. So I do think that part is true, but I think we didn't have a mature pipeline for how do animations get from soft homage, where the animators are working, into the game engine. There was a lot of massaging that had to be happening, a lot of sort of custom tooling that had to happen. Whereas for the 2D pipeline, it was very well known. So I think what we gained in flexibility in terms of like, yes, there is just one character and we just render from whatever angle we need for that scene. The complexity was squeezed over into the animation side, because then we had to deal with, okay, he might be walking around with 10 different things in his hand, and, we want to have the walk cycle blend and whatever. And the stuff where it's like, oh, there's a special animation of Guybrush with the banana picker, right? Or the monkey wrench, like, and it's only there for a few seconds and that's it. Like, that's really clear what's going to happen there. But if Guybrush was supposed to walk around in 3D with the monkey wrench, and you had to have it not clip through doors and walls and desks like Manny's scythe, which is the equivalent of this giant thing he was going to hang on to, and, not be mashing it through walls when you turn around or whatever. there was a lot of considerations there. So I think, we did a lot of work with the Grim Fandango. So the Jedi Knight team did they had this thing called Model X, which was this thing for art tech tools. So there was sort of I would say there's this space of like the artist realm of like soft homage and 3D Studio Max. And then there's the game engine side of like sort of fixed assets. And there's this sort of gray area in the middle of what we call art teching. And we have specialized people and specialized tools to like try and massage that stuff into an art pipeline so that it could be used in the game. I think that's where the expense was. Yeah, I think what made Grim Fandango so expensive? I'm not the right person to answer that question.
Your salaries.
Salaries. Well, not my salary.
I'm kidding.
So to give you a sense,
maybe team took the 2.5 million and paid the rest of you.
Yeah. So let's be clear. Like anybody other than the product lead did not get any royalty or bonus or anything like that. Only the product lead ever did, and it was up to them where they wanted to share with the rest of the team. That didn't happen so much on Graham. It happened on some other projects. It didn't, so it's not unusual that it didn't happen. But the other thing is, like, I came out of school, I started out making $30,000 a year. So, I mean, and I was like so desperate, like I was just so excited to have a job that I didn't really negotiate at all. And so they got me really cheap. They brought me up very quickly while in the 4 or 5 years I was there. But $30,000 a year, even at that time, not a lot of money. It was not, it is not considered not like it is now, where it's like a very specialized skill set that warrants a higher salary. So, yeah, they weren't paying us a lot. Actually, one of my, I don't want to speak too ill because obviously there were good things that happened too, but we were not paid very well and we're not treated very well. So, two stories I tell to kind of illustrate that. One is when episode 1 was being made, they had a company meeting for LucasArts, and they had us at the Marin Civic Center, which is this amazing building. It's in Gattaca. It's this beautiful building, Frank Lloyd Wright. And they said, okay, we have a special treat. You're going to be the first people, or the people who worked on it, who have ever seen the trailer for episode 1. And so this is a really special thing. We're going to do it. And like they showed us that. It was like, oh, everybody was so excited. Like chills, this new Star Wars that nobody's ever seen. And they went on and said, we are not the biggest publisher, but we're the most profitable publisher. Like for every dollar, we punch above our weight and our games sell really well per game and all this. And they told us how well we were doing. And they asked if any questions. And I'll never forget. I don't know if it was Brad Post or Brad Taylor. I think it was Brad Taylor. He already knew he was leaving. And so he had a job offer somewhere else. And so he had the great courage. He asked the question and they said, yeah, Brad, what's your question? He said, yeah, I got a question. You say how well we're doing everything. When are we going to see any of that? And there was this sort of collective like he has spoken the unspeakable. And then like everybody's like, wow, what is the answer to that question? But yeah, so at the time, LucasArts was not paying people well. And there was a notion that game programmers were replaceable. And that we were all very lucky to work at the Star Wars company where everybody else wanted to work. And if we didn't want to work there were 10 people who would line up to work there for less. And that was there. I mean, that was in the air that working at Lucasfilm or LucasArts was part of our salary to some extent, and therefore we should get paid less than we might to work at another game developer, which is really pretty fucked up. Sorry for my language, but it was there. It was there, and there was a notion of like, well, you should be happy with what you get. Yeah. So they didn't play.
You're not the first person to say that, so it's fine.
Yeah. I hope I'm not. I hope I'm not the only one. There's another. The other story I tell is this is funny. Nick Pavis. He was the at the time it was we were doing PlayStations. They're doing like Masters of Terrascasi and some other game was going to PlayStation. And the wisdom at the time was like, well, we don't know consoles. If you're going to program for consoles, you need to get yourself a Brit. And so Nick was the token Brit who was like brought in to work on these PlayStation ports, and he was breaking himself. Like, and so when I was in Crunch on Grim Fandango, he was there every night as well. And just, if we need to take a break, just go to the other person's office because they're going to be there. Building's going to be empty, but I bet his office is lit up. And Crunch on Grim was legendarily, even for a very crunch heavy time at LucasArts, Grim Fandango's crunch was really off the charts. But he was crunching every night. And so he was there every Saturday, Sunday. He never took a day off. And so the story that really kind of made me start looking elsewhere was he went to Malcolm, who was the director of technology at the time, and said, "Hey, so my friend's getting married in Vegas. I'm in his wedding party. I'm going to fly out on Saturday morning and I'll be at the wedding there and I'll fly back and I should be back at work on Sunday." And Malcolm was like busy, and I was like standing outside the office. I heard this exchange, and Malcolm said, "Okay, so when are you going to make up the time?" It was like, I'm going to invent another day in the week. I'm going to invent Blur's Day and put it between Sunday and Monday, and I'm going to work that day. It's like the guy was already working 7 days a week. So there were no more days that could be made up. And that was I think a period in time where we were kind of grist for the mill. It wasn't great. And I think there was an extreme burnout, and we were not paid enough to burn ourselves that hard. But I think a lot of us were like me, were young, they were fresh out of school, or they had only ever worked there. And there was a notion that, it's okay to burn out these young people who are, pouring everything they have into these games because it's, they're getting the opportunity to work here on these games. Sorry, I had to tell those stories, but.
Well, recently Tim talked about crunch time and how he regrets that in his projects, there was a lot of crunch time and that he was mainly responsible for most of it.
I'm glad to hear him say that. He was responsible for a lot of it. LucasArts was organized and progressive and way ahead of his time in some ways and really backwards in others. And one of the ways that they maybe took a really time to learn is that just because somebody is really good or visionary or a great designer or a great programmer does not make them a good manager and does not make them a good producer. That those are different skill sets, and that the people who are really good at those things are not necessarily the right people to look out for the health and well-being of the people who are working on that thing. But at LucasArts, it was everything went up to that one person. The one person who is responsible for, yes, he'll have a producer, or yes, he'll have a lead designer, or whatever, but ultimately, it stops there. Tim was very singular about his vision for what the game should be. And when, there's a very contentious meeting he had at one point where it's like, the game is done when I say it's done and not sooner, and you'll work on it till I tell you to stop. Very bad meeting for me, because I was really burnt out and I need to be told it was okay to rest. And I was telling him I can't go on. And he was saying, well, you will go on, and it was sort of a threat, as opposed to this. I've pushed this person to the breaking point and I can't keep pushing them. I need to let them rest. So I was, when I watched that video, I was happy to see Tim has kind of come around on that. And I think he's seen enough of that, but he definitely, he pushed it before he learned. And it was seen for full throttle. He burnt out programmers in particular. The curve on games is that programmers are kind of first on, last off. The first on in that you're making the game engine and trying to make everything work and the tools and laying things out before you go into full production. And that's when you kind of ramp up, this lot of developers, a lot of designers, a lot of art people. And then they come off the end, and the programmers on the tail end, smoothing out, making everything shippable and fixing bugs. And so you can, I think Tim was known for being really, really tight with the artists and designers, and for kind of burning out and kind of burning through relationship with programmers. So I wasn't the first. I liked him. I don't want to speak too ill of him, and I think this is also maybe part of it was LucasArts culture. Part of it's just game industry at the time. We just didn't have norms for how to treat people and what's healthy work-life balance, because everybody was just, games are made by blood, sweat, and tears, and that's what makes a good game. That was the notion. And people were burning themselves out left and right. And especially, we didn't have to advocate for ourselves or recognize burnout, because, like, for me, it was my first job. First game, first job, first anything. And so I was like, white knuckle ride, trying to on my imposter roller coaster every day, and not knowing how to advocate for yourself or to media yourself. So, there's a lot of burnout in that game. Huge amount.
It really pains me to hear how people suffered during the production of my favorite games, because, even I talked to a lot of people who worked on The Dig, and The Dig is one of my favorite point-and-click adventure games. And everyone I talked to says how much they suffered during the production of that project due to it having 4 iterations and the various cancellations of the various versions. And I even talked to David Fox, who didn't work on The Dig, and I asked him if, since he was the director of operations around that time, I asked him if he had any trivia tidbits that I didn't know about The Dig, but he said that the only thing he knows about The Dig is that he's happy that he didn't work on that project. So
burned through a lot of people. At the same time, it does take courage to cancel something when it's not working. And there are a lot of other projects and games that I know of where people didn't have the courage to cancel them, and it was worse because people dragged them through so much time before they finally got it right. But at the same time, when they did this, so they sort of on again, off again, and new person, it means that a lot of stuff's getting thrown away. And it's never a great feeling when you work on something that then never reaches the market. But yeah, I can see The Dig also burned people out quite a lot.
Yeah, the Dig was LucasArts and Duke Nukem Forever, something that went into production, ended 11 years later.
Yeah.
Or so.
It's funny you mention that because Duke was one of the games that Ray Gresco at Jedi Knight was like, oh, I can't wait for DNF to come out. Oh, it's going to be such a big deal. And I
hope he didn't hold his breath.
Sorry, it wasn't Duke Nukem Forever. It was Duke Nukem 3D. And it had been such a huge thing. Yeah, it came out, and it was a huge deal. He's like, look at all this chrome. This game's filled with chrome. And he loved using the term chrome for just attention to detail, like reflections in this mirror or whatever. How did they do that? But yeah, I think the Dig was this sort of, because it had sort of Spielberg and Lucas's attention and sort of names associated with it. It was never going to be fully canceled, but it was also never going to be right because there were always these compromises that needed to be made. So, kudos to Sean and everybody else who worked on that to get it out eventually and just we just got to make it an adventure game,
Yeah, I'm trying to get Sean for a conversation to hear his side of the story, since he was the one that eventually got The Dig out there.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I always DM him on LinkedIn and he doesn't reply. But he's the first person to like every conversation I post on LinkedIn. So we're playing hide and seek.
Sean, come on, man. You gotta come in and let your hair down and let it go. Just spill the tea. Let all the tea spill this time.
Yeah, I want us to talk about the fun aspects of Grime. Yeah. You talked about a floating point, and they brought Dave Grossman to work on the Destruction Derby in Full Throttle because it had an isometric angle. And so they had to, since it didn't have a floating point, he had to do all kinds of hacks to make this whole thing work.
Yep.
And so how did you start working on Grime, and how did you decide to use Grime and not one of the other engines, for example?
I mean, you could call Grime a customized version of Sith, in that it uses Model X and Render Droid and Leia and a bunch of other stuff. But what makes it a new engine is that it also used other stuff. It also used Aaron's text rendering library, font rendering. It also used Aaron's Aaron Giles asset loading from Outlaws. It used IMUs. There's things that it did that were not the same, but it did reuse. It did, if they hadn't been working on Jedi Knight, I could not have made Grim Fandango. There's no question. Because it borrowed so much texture formats and animation and like camera systems and everything. I talked a little bit about fixed point, floating point, palletization. Really, the test things we did where we're like, okay, I'm just going to do the best possible, palette restricted version of this background and that character. And the lighting went to hell because, in order for lighting to work well in 3D, you need to have more. The whole point of the lighting is that you get nice smooth shading, and we wanted nice smooth Kuro shading on Manny's head, and that all went completely quantized, and it looked terrible. There was an art pipeline, but like I said, the art pipeline was just so geared around 2D, it was hard to crack open and even think about using 3D. The best tools and pipeline we had for dealing with 3D assets was the Jedi Knight stuff. And it shared nothing in common with this very nice 2D assets and pipelines and tools, in the Scum system, Bioflem, Syst, Mucus, all the other tools you've heard about. They were all, you'd have to crack open every one of those and make them 3D sort of capable or aware. Very clear, very early on that we would need costumes. Costume is this sort of special purpose animation, custom animation. In Scum, you say a character puts on a costume to do a special action, then takes off the costume, puts on his normal costume. So a costume is like a collection of animations and assets. And so we very clearly had to have, just from early puzzle design and talking about how the engine would work, we needed to have costumes that consisted both of 3D elements, like Manny having a special animation for, running the bone grinder or whatever, or like, taking a piece of bread and making it into crumbs or whatever, along with a screen space item like the tube in his office. When the tube arrives at the very beginning of the game and, pneumatic tube, a thing shows up, that's fully 2D in the foreground. And we're just flipping some flip book of animation through there. It's just normal. It's pre-rendered. There's no reason it has to be 3D. The only thing that needs to be 3D is the thing that he pulls out because it goes with his hand. And so this notion that we're going to have to mix costumes that were 2D and 3D, and just, I could not fathom how I was going to do that. It was easier for me to say some of these elements are 2D than to say everything's 2D and that some of these elements are 3D. It was never going to work that way, especially with the fixed point. So that's the kind of stuff that went into the decision. I didn't call it Grime at the time. I didn't know that it was going to be sort of a new engine. It was just sort of, what do I need to do to make this work, as I said. The thing that kind of made it special was Lua, which was, having pulled all these pieces from Jedi Knight and Outlaws and other places. The notion that a scripting language was really powerful. And that was, I guess Scum, there's a name for the language in Scum, which is separate from the engine itself, but I'm having trouble remembering it. You probably know better than I do. But that was a really powerful and potent thing people needed to do. And so it was like, all right, so say you've got all this new power and new flexibility of this Jedi Knight tool set and pipeline and assets, you still need to make it scriptable. And so that's where I put my energy in. It was like, well, if I could concentrate on just that problem, I think that's solvable. And that was an interesting one. I had taken, I'd written a compiler at Bing University. And so I was like, well, at least that's something I've done in the past as opposed to this other stuff I haven't. So maybe I'll need to do that. But it turned out I didn't need to because Lua appeared on the scene. There's a Dr. Jobs, probably have the article down there, Dr. Jobs journal. And Winston Wolfe on the Jedi Knight team said, hey, you're looking at scripting languages. Have you seen this? And he gave me this Dr. Dobbs article, which Dr. Dobbs journal is programming magazine. And it was an article by these researchers about Lua. And I was like, well, this sounds interesting. And they just hooked up a modem at my desktop so I could actually get on the internet, dial up from my desktop at LucasArts. So I dialed up and connected to their FTP site and downloaded Lua. And within an afternoon playing with him, like, this is good. There's something really good here. It was small. It compiled small. It was easy to work with. It was easy to learn. I wanted something that I could hand to Tim, who was, also had a CS degree, but had not programmed in anything other than Scum for years and years. I want something I could hand to him and have him like read the manual for the language, and it was only like 15 pages, and have him be up and running. And it was very successful that way. I think Lua is a great, tight little embedded language. We were the first people to put it in a game, as far as I know. There's a lot of stuff out there about presenting on that, and that it influenced others. Baldur's Gate, I think, was the next one. Which, hey, very timely. Baldur's Gate 3 is out now, but and then World of Warcraft put it in their scripting, and that was like after that, Lua was endemic to the industry. But I had put it in there. I was like, okay, part of that demo of like, can I have a 2D element and a text and a 3D character and clipping behind desks, and can I have a script running it all? And so it was literally like I had a single Lua script, which was like basically put this line on the screen above this character. So calculate where it should be, automatically make sure it would wrap if they're at the edge of the screen. And then as you move the character around, his text would wrap, but it was clearly being driven from Lua. At that point, it was like, well, what's Scum giving us at this point? Like, what are we leaving behind? And obviously there's pedigree, and it was sort of a known quantity. But it was also like, now we can start doing things. You know, we have enough elements to actually wire a room together and have it all work. Honestly, I think if I tried to work with Scum, it would have required me to kind of reverse engineer Scum and to become the kind of 2D programmer that I had not been in order to bring it then forward back up to 3D, which is kind of where I lived. So yeah, I mean, and then again, part of it's like nobody stopped me, right? Like smarter people more concerned with risk might have stopped me, but they didn't. And I owe a lot of people thanks for that. Even Eric, in sort of his sort of dour, sort of like, well, yeah, give it a try, but you're not the first to try. They let me try ultimately, and again, partially because I didn't know how hard it was. You know, we tried and succeeded. So.
Maybe they let you try because they thought you would fail. Just like Brian Moriarty tried to use StoryDroid for the dig instead of Scum, and he failed.
Yeah.
Maybe Eric was sure that you'd fail and come back crawling, ask for
maybe
help from the Scum Lord.
Help from the Scum Lord. Well, I mean, that makes it sound like Eric is
no, Eric
is a failure, and I don't think that's the case. I think he's a very sweet person, and I don't think he ever thought that. I think he'd been through the conversations enough with StoryDroid and with the stuff with Insane on Full Throttle that he was not going to have it again. Like he's like, I've seen this happen, and I'm not going to try an argument because I know it doesn't work. I just have to see what happens.
I'm sure he wanted you to succeed, and if anything, Insane in Full Throttle enhanced Scum.
It's true.
It didn't replace Scum.
It's true. But before that happened, they tried to make stuff just with Insane, I believe, and that didn't go as well. By the way, Brian Moriarty, the game I always thought LucasArts should have made that never did, that I always want to see, like the other games in the Loom, like each guild having its own game. Mm-hmm. Oh my God,
Rusty the Forge and the Fold.
Forge. The game I wanted was Forge.
Now I'm trying to get this up and running. I talked to Mark Ferrari a while ago, and I asked him if Brian Moriarty wants to do Loom 2, will G be up for it to join as the designer? And he said that he'd be up for it. And back in 2015, Brian Moriarty had his GDC talk, in which he said at the end of the talk that he is willing to give 3 companies the ability to make the sequels to Loom. And he said that he's going to work with Double Fine, Telltale Games, and Jedi games. Now, from all 3, Double Fine, I know that Tim doesn't work on games that aren't his.
There is, yeah.
Telltale Games may change the format of the game into something more narrative-driven and, a visual novel instead of an adventure game. And Jedi are perfect for that. And so I asked Dave Gilbert from Jedi if he's willing to work on Loom. And he said if someone is willing to handle the copyright issues. And so I got someone from Disney, and he said that he's willing to work something out. And I've got all three, and I just need Brian Moriarty, and maybe we'll be able to see the Forge.
I'd love to see Forge
one day.
I saw a pitch for Forge at some point. I was like, oh, it sounds really interesting game. Anyway.
Now, back to Grime. When did you decide to use pre-rendered 3D backgrounds for Grim Fandango? Because a year after, in Infernal Machine, there is an Easter egg in which you can change Indy into Guybrush. And so you're walking into the barber shop, and the barber shop from Curse of Monkey Island is created in 3D in Indiana Jones and the
I didn't even know this.
Infernal Machine.
This might have been after I don't even know.
And so I always wondered, it seemed like it was possible to create 3D backgrounds with the 3D characters themselves. Why wasn't it done?
Well, so two reasons. One is they have to be really low res, because every polygon that you put into the background is a polygon you can't put into your character. They're coming out of the same budget. And two is just artistic intent. We had our influences. There's a game called Bioforge, which is a major influence. I had played it before I joined the company, and Tim had played it separately, and we both saw like a lot to like in it. Game is funny. It's an adventure game. It is pre-rendered 3D backgrounds with 3D boxy characters, and there's a funny puzzle where you have to. The guy's arm gets cut off as he reaches through a laser thing on his prison cell, and you have to take his arm and beat him with it. It's quite a production in of itself. Product of a fevered mind. But Tim had been looking at this notion that like the number of polygons you have. I mean, think about the polygon budget we had. If we had a polygon budget, let's say 600 polygons on screen, it's all we could manage with software rasterizing, which is we couldn't assume hardware at that point. And Manny's like 180, 200, something like that, depending on which costume he's wearing. It doesn't leave a lot for like the other characters in the scene. Like the blue casket scene, has all these skeletons in it, and half of them are 2D part of the background because we can't render them all. And that doesn't leave you a lot of computational power for doing nicely rendered stuff or, really detailed stuff. So think of those nice filigreed, kind of Art Deco shapes. There's no way you can do that in full 3D. The other thing is Tim at the time he wanted things to be more cinematic. We wanted things to be more like a director, where you could have a really meaningful camera setup or frame characters in a certain way for a conversation or a cutscene, and cut across. It was the first time we really had to bring in sort of filmmaker considerations around cutscenes, like these two characters. You never want to have a camera and it's pointing across at this character with the reverse on this character, and then it's like when you flip, you don't want to cross the line because it disorients people. Like all this sort of film school language about how to make cinematography. Tim really wanted to put that in, and a lot of the inspiration for the game, all these noir movies had really interesting cinematography and really interesting camera angles. And so he was less interested in like, we need a dynamic, we're trying to make virtual reality or some facsimile of a 3D world, and more that we're trying to make a really cinematic story. And that means the best stuff I've seen is in film, and film noir in particular. And that's what we're looking to emulate. I referred earlier to my imposter syndrome. I think probably the worst element of that was very early on when I was employed. We were still doing design for Grim Fandango, and so we had all these influences. We watched a lot of watch parties for these movies and had gone to various locations around the Bay Area that were Art Deco, and we were doing a lot of sort of whiteboarding characters and sniffing the smelly pens and getting all high and coming up with all this crazy stuff, which I really love. And that's the non-technical part of the job that I loved. But they were telling, we still didn't have a notion of like, what does Manny look like? What does Colossus look like? What does this world look like? So Peter was sort of, ripping things out and throwing a lot of concepts at us. But what does the actual game look like? We didn't have an idea. But all I knew is there were going to be skeletons. And although we had sort of this notion of like, what does a Day of the Dead skeleton look like? It's not anatomically correct. there was a demo that dropped around that time, which scared the living shit out of me. And it was called Into the Shadows. You ever heard of this demo? Yeah. So Into the Shadows was it was not a full game. It was a demo, meaning, as if you know anything about the demo scene, it's like, if you look at it sideways, it breaks. Like all that code is, they're not writing general purpose code, but I didn't know that. And so this Into the Shadows thing was like, it was a skeleton waving around a sword in this dungeon with like these torches, and the camera was swiveling around the skeleton, and you could see individual ribs and see between them, and there was lighting from the torches, and it was really dramatic. And I thought, I can't do that. I have no idea how to make this thing that I'm looking. I couldn't do this. So if like you're expecting me to put skeletons on the screen and like that's what things, and I'm looking up against something, I can't do this. They got the wrong guy. And so I was really terrified. And they're like, no, like that is not the look we're after. And when I think about the Infernal Machine and sort of full 3D environments, it would have looked like Into the Shadows, right? Which is like really sort of low res backgrounds to be able to have like a fit within the poly budget and the rendering budget. And it would have been very dynamic, but it also would have been very low detail. I think of as like Ultima Underworld, and Ultima Underworld, magnificent. I love that game. Totally undersung. Ultima Underworld, like there were a lot of sort of really low res elements in it because it was just barely managing to like pull off the 3D world in the first place. And so there's a lot of compromises there, like kind of squinting and like, is that what I think it is? And like, if it's over, really, things don't scale very well. Whereas when you do pre-rendered backgrounds, you can put as much compute into every pixel as you want, right? And then that meant we got to be doing these really elaborate backgrounds. We had these amazing artists who came in and worked with Softimage and learned it very quickly. We were using Mental Ray for the shading and did really nice lighting model, special renderer. And people from ILM like Kyle Blabla came over and trained a bunch of people. Here's how we use, here's how you model in Softimage, and here's how you use Mental Ray really well. And we had a lot of classically trained 2D artists who we taught to do 3D, who brought incredible talent over. Adam Schnitzer. I don't know if have you ever heard the story about the Cake of Betrayal? Cake of Betrayal. So for Grim Fandango, we hired a lot of 2D artists, and we figured we interviewed a lot of people. A lot of people applied, and they had these portfolios which were a lot of we called them the shiny robot portfolio. Everybody had a shiny robot portfolio because that's what early 3D tools were good at. They were good at like really hard surfaces and shiny robots. That's what everybody made. Sexy shiny robot. And it was all very boring and very the same. And these people clearly, like, they knew how to use the tool, but they were not artists, either character artists or background artists or animators. They were just not that. And it was actually better for Grim Fandango. And this might have been why it was such a big production, is that we did actually bring on a bunch of 2D people and train them up. Like, for the first time, we're going to train you to use these 3D programs, and you're going to bring along your squash and stretch experience from 2D at Ringling School of Art and Design. You make cartoons. You're going to learn how to use this 3D tool, and investing in those people and training them up. Well, one of those people was Adam Schnitzer, who was this brilliant illustrator, makes amazing stuff. And we trained him up really, really well. He's responsible for some of the best backgrounds and best rooms in Grim Fandango. Did a great job translating Peter's concept stuff into reality. Master of lighting and shadow, really, really good. And as soon as we kind of got him up to speed, he's like, all right, well, I'm leaving for this job over at this thing called Pixar. And Tim was super burnt up about it because he's like, he basically used our training and then he used to get this job elsewhere. And so there, there's always this tradition of a goodbye party for everybody. And so there's this, we're having the goodbye party down at the lounge, right? Well, Tim, aren't you going down there? There's cake over there. And he's like, I won't eat the cake of betrayal. Like the cake of betrayal was, and we always talked about it, the cake of betrayal. He would not celebrate the departure of this person he invested a bunch in. But yeah, Adam went on and did, like, I still see him in credits for Pixar stuff all over the place. And he's been hugely influential on how Pixar movies look. Again, just ridiculous amount of talent in that time that went to amazing places. What was I saying? Oh, so why wasn't it full 3D? It could have been full 3D, but it would have been full 3D in like 320 by 240 or full 3D in 640 by 480, but with like really low res everything and palletized 8-bit everything. So I think ultimately,
go ahead. You did a great job with Grim Fandango, because even though you had very low polygon quota to use, still didn't look empty. And my main problem with Escape from Monkey Island, which came out 2 years after, is that all of the islands look super empty.
Mm.
I mean, up to the point they had to change the plot to explain that some real estate mogul bought all the real estate on Melly Island, so that's why there's no one there.
Oh.
But in every scene, you could only see 3 characters in addition to Guybrush. And so it's more apparent in Escape, which came out 2 years after Grim, while on Grim, it doesn't seem that empty. If anything, it looks more lively than Escape does.
I have a theory.
How did you manage that?
I have a theory about that. I think that Escape from Monkey Island was trying to emulate the look of previous Monkey Island games in terms of where the camera was and how much you would see in a given room. I think it looked very similar in terms of proportions and like, look and feel like this feels like Melee Island. And at that distance, you need more things moving. You need to see more interesting things happening. You need a guy spinning on the chandelier, in the scum bar or whatever. You need the men of the fiber and the rat, with a polygon budget, especially at the time, the PC, the stretch between a low-end PC and a high-end PC it was huge, just gigantic. And we had a saying: your target market was whatever was for sale for half off at CompUSA at Christmas the year before. Right? Like that was your target machine, because that's what there'd be the most of in market. And as much as you would want to use the high end and whatever was available, you had to budget for that in order for your game to have a viable market. And so I think that their polygon budgets were probably not all that much higher than Grim Fandango's. Meanwhile, they wanted to put more into the characters, so Guybrush is much more detailed than Manny is in Escape from Monkey Island. And so I think that's where the budget goes. Is they put it into the main characters you're going to see a lot. I think with Grim Fandango, because it was a little bit more cinematic, there was a lot more framing of close-ups. Close-ups and lots of I think of like scenes in your casino where you're talking to Chowchilla Charlie and there's like a close up of the booth with the two of you in the booth, or like you're talking to Nick Virago at the table in the High Roller Casino, and like there's some very close cuts there. I think Grim Fandango probably put more effort into filling the screen with the action that you intend to see, as opposed to like you're in a location and you're walking around the location, which is
still have several wide shots in which you can see things moving. How did you manage that? Was Manny the same amount of polygons when he was in those wide shots?
I mean, we had level of detail, but it wasn't like a separate level of detail. It was special for wide shots. It was just like there's a generic set of like Manny low, medium, high, and then we just the engine just picked whichever one was appropriate. But things like. So how did they differ, the versions of Manny? Did they have low res texture and high res texture, but the same amount of polygons? Low res texture, high res texture. And then the other thing is there actually were like automatically decimated low poly versions. And that was part of something that came through the Model X pipeline. And I didn't put a lot of control on it. So there are some scenes where it's like when he's really far away, his finger bones are basically just not visible, or he has a single flat thing there. But the thing I think of is like Rubikava, which is where a lot of the game takes place. There's things moving in almost every scene in the background. So there's a lot of water. And that was all done with Smush. That was all insane animation that was pre-rendered. And same thing like
2D animation.
What's that? Yeah, it's 2D
animation.
It's 2D animation. It's canned animation or looping animation. Same thing, like you're running under the blimp and there's like, this sort of propeller kind of thing going on. And it's like, and there's sort of ambient noise. But Rubikava, there's not a lot of characters. There's a lot of, and they honestly, they do say you say that there was the conceit in Escape from Macau that a real estate broker bought everything up, and that's why everything was empty. In Grim Fandango, the conceit is that every day, it's the Day of the Dead every 4 years, and everybody's gone to go back to their ofrendas to see their relatives in the real world. So it's...
Yeah, but still, it feels like part of the plot, and it's much less apparent than it is in Escape.
Yeah, I really do think it comes down to, like, for every location, and that was kind of coming up to the notion of, like, there's a set, and then there's a setup. A set is like literally like a set in a movie studio, and the setup is like a particular camera setup, shot or angle with a rendered background that's within that set. And I think there's a lot more attention on Grim Fandango paid to the setups, which are the sort of specific camera, useful for a particular cutscene, a particular conversation. I think Escape probably had less of that. Now, I'm saying all this, having not actually worked on Escape from Monkey Island for more than just a few months, and having left before it was completed. And I will confess now, having never played it. So I've only ever seen it over people's shoulders and in streams and things like that.
No, I'm interviewing Mike Stamley next week. I'll let him know that you didn't play the game.
Yeah, no, I think definitely talk to Mike and Sean, because there were compromises made. Randy Stevenson took over as lead programmer when I left. But yeah, I mean, I think we were, another thing, Dreamcast. Another thing that I think is a big factor there is that Escape from Monkey Island was desperately trying to be on the Dreamcast and potentially on PlayStation as well. And therefore, they were probably trying to...
Was on PlayStation.
Was it on PlayStation? I guess it was eventually.
Yeah,
but they were desperately trying to keep the poly count and character count down because they thought they might have to scale down to those systems from PC at that point. So that that might also be a factor in why there was less going on screen.
I tried to test that theory by using Aaron Giles as a Dream emulator to see you can activate a status line that tells you how many polygons you have in Escape from Monkey Island. So in the scenes in which you can see more than 3 characters, like for example, you haven't played the game, but there is a scene in which you see 3 judges and a swimmer and Guybrush, so you have 4 characters. But since the judges are behind a table, then they probably don't have the lower half of their bodies because the polygon number is not as high. How did you create the 2D, the 3D pre-rendered backgrounds?
So this was all novel stuff that we, again, a part of being imposter and not knowing how I was going to do this has also meant that, like, looking back, I can now recognize we were just constantly inventing stuff that was pretty clever. And part of that was just like, I got to figure out the closest thing that's going to work to solve this general problem. And this is actually a problem with the Dreamcast port, which we'll talk about in a sec, which is why Grim Fandango never came to other systems. So Softimage, to its credit, had the ability to render out a Z buffer, which means that for every pixel value that it rendered, it would also render a Z depth. Now, that was useful. I could say, if you're going to make a setup, part of making a setup is you've got to give me the Z buffers for it, and I'll use that for clipping the characters. But there are weird things because a color channel has, like 16-bit color, 24-bit color, quantized down to 16-bit color, and there's still like, about 8-bit per channel, and you can make something that reasonable looks on screen. A Z buffer, if you try to represent it as color, just looks like a mess. So it was really hard to debug sometimes what was going on. But basically, I had them anytime that they rendered any 2D piece of art, if it was a background, it had a Z buffer associated with it. And if it was an animated piece, like, for example, we talked about the pneumatic tube being 2D, if they were rendering out a sort of a flip book of different states, they would also render out the Z buffer for those different states as well. And so the notion was that anytime we brought that into the costume system, if there was a costume that had a 2D element, or it was just the background, there was always a Z buffer. That's fine when you're doing software, because you can render against your own Z buffer. Everything's in software anyway. It gets harder when you go to hardware. So when 3DFX and the early NVIDIA cards came out, we had to adapt on the fly because the game had been in production for such a long time that they were becoming affordable and mainstream. And so we had to note this notion that we should be able to use hardware if it's available. Jedi and I had the same problem. we had this issue where it's like, oh, if you're doing pure 3D, it's fine. But if you're actually doing 2D as well, now it's a question of what formats does the card support? What is it fast at? And if you need to render something into the Z channel, Z buffer, can you even do that? Will the card allow you to do it? If not, we have to fall back to software rendering. But basically, it was all coming down to like this notion that a Z channel was a legit piece of art that should be treated as an asset like everything else, and we should commit to rendering them everywhere. Became a problem with Escape from Monkey Island because they wanted to go to Dreamcast. Dreamcast does not have a Z buffer, nor does PlayStation 1 at least. And so you cannot make a game with the same assumptions where we had pixel perfect clipping. If Manny goes behind a desk and there's some elaborate, crenellated pattern on the edge of the desk, every pixel has an actual Z depth. And when he goes behind it, it's going to be perfect. For Dreamcast, Randy, I think, worked on this. So basically, they had to say, we're going to make he called them like surfboards. Like we had to make these sort of cardboard cutouts of the 3D thing that we use as stencil masks, because stencils are supported on Dreamcast, but not Z buffers. And so the notion that you had to take your Z buffer and then generate a stencil mask from that and then use that, but also know where the character was, that which stencil he's going to clip against. So that was one of the challenges there when we tried to take the engine to other platforms, because when we decided it was only for PC and we were doing a software renderer.
This is vertical scrolling all over again.
A little bit. Yeah. I mean, to some extent, it's scaling down, though, rather than, But yeah, it's a similar problem in that you just can't anticipate a different constraint that's going to get thrown at you that is a fundamental assumption that is bedrock. So yeah, I think that might also go to Escape as well, just in terms of, I don't know what they were dealing with in terms of their constraints. It's probably a way more efficient engine in all the 2D sides. The 2D side for Grim is very inefficient. I did a dirty rec system where it's like, if I rendered over this, the channel might be, have Manny rendered over this background element, and now I need to re-render the fresh art so that I can render Manny on top again for the next scene. And I'm going to keep doing this, like keeping a bounding box for where was Manny? Okay, I got to refresh that art before I draw him again because he might have moved. And so there's a lot of conversation, a lot of effort gone into the sturdy rec system, which I didn't know if it was actually a win or not. In some cases, it might have taken more effort to calculate and split the sturdy rec than to just say, we're just drawing the whole screen from scratch anyway, every scene anyway, just do it. But, it's the kind of thing where it's like we weren't sure, but we did the best we could and invented what we could. What else about Z buffers? Debugging them was hard. Had to write a tool that would make a grayscale version of it that was also quantized, so that, and kind of same issues you have a fixed point of can you render this depth? Well, you can't render smooth depth all the way out because you don't have that many colors in the screen. You only have 256, so you gotta have it kind of fade and then go fade again, and so you have these sort of zones of depth. But I don't know if there's a debug mode. There might be a debug mode where you can play with just the Z buffers rendered. It'd be interesting to look at.
iPhone's portrait mode works the same way. Have several layers of depth, and they're determined by grayscale, so that you can tell which part is.
Yeah, and I think
So you were pioneers back then.
We were pioneers for a lot of things. I was pioneers for the other thing I know I was a pioneer on, and I'm kind of proud of. Is Lua multitasking, cooperative multitasking, and Lua, what other systems would call it, like fibers or lightweight threads or coroutines. Didn't know what I was doing. Independently reinvented this concept and implemented it in a language that ended up going totally mainstream for game development and was important enough that got added to the core language because enough game developers wanted it. So yeah, there were things like that we invented kind of on as needed. But that was, very much like the way people were used to writing in Scum was that it was cooperative multitasking, this notion of yield, which basically means, you're obviously going to run a little bit of logic every frame, but threads are too heavyweight for that, and a a routine might just be something that looks for an opportunity to change a camera angle, or something that's going to, specify which set of sound should be used for the footsteps based on is it a metal or concrete. Mm-hmm. And you need to have those things be happening independent of any game logic or conversation or whatever else is going on. And so I think that's something that we very much brought over from Scum, which was this notion that cooperative multitasking was hugely important to making adventure games and games in general. And if we didn't have that, then we were screwed. And so that was a big piece of it. Even though Lua was a kind of a done deal, the cooperative multitasking wasn't. And I really want people to be able to write scripts with the same level of abstraction that they did for Monkey Island. That's the example I always gave people is like, in Monkey Island, a piece of Scum code might be like, actor Guybrush, walk to a banana tree, wait for Guybrush. Actor Guybrush, face camera, wait for Guybrush. Actor Guybrush, say line, blah, blah, wait for line, and then do the thing. It's like very cinematic. It's like you're just writing a script of exactly what should happen to describe it. And you're never thinking at the same time, make these pigeons make noises or make them strut around, or, there's a separate script that does that. And the only thing that's a critical point is there at any point there, anything should be able to say yield. And then it gives the other things a chance to run. So yeah, I think that was another thing I was really proud of that we put in there. I presented on that
maybe moving Manny's head.
What's that?
Maybe moving Manny's head was another achievement.
Manny's head was definitely a hack. Tim had this notion that he wanted less, he wanted fewer verbs, he wanted less on the screen with each game. And so, Full Throttle, he got down to 3 verbs or something like punch, lick, and kick. Or hand, face, and foot, essentially, are the verbs.
And eyes, mouth.
Yeah. We had a joke about we wanted to make the game with one verb. Have you ever heard this story? I don't know if
no, but I know the Dick had one verb because it didn't have any verbs. It was just cursor that would highlight whenever. Yeah,
we had this notion that we want to make a game we called it the Village Idiot game. The idea that you're mute, you don't have the ability to talk, and all you can do is point at things. And so it's like point was the only verb, and that the notion that maps very well to a cursor in a game and a mouse pointer. And the notion of point, it's like, if you want to know about something, you point at it, you go, oh, and then the other characters are like, what? What? You want to know about that hat? Okay, that hat, that's my dad's hat, whatever. And it's like you point at something until somebody gives it to you, things like that. So the notion of reducing the number of actions you had to consider and the combinatorial explosion to more accurately reflect your intent of I'm interacting with a thing. I don't need to know if it's one of the 9 verbs or whatever it was from Maniac Mansion. I don't remember how many it was. And so the notion that, this is where the notion of tank controls comes from. This is the notion of where the head look comes from, of having fewer things on the screen, and that, it should be more contextual and sort of based on the context and sort of your observations of Manny as sort of as a representation of you, and a little bit more sort of over the shoulder kind of stuff going on, which is different than the 2D world. And the notion that Manny tilting his head, oh, what's that? Oh, he's kind of looking around, was a way to do that. And because Manny's head was already sort of a large cylindrical thing, it was very noticeable when the axis changed. And so that made him, if his head had been round or square, it would not have worked nearly as well because his silhouette wouldn't have changed very much as he swiveled around. But because he had this cylindrical thing and the sort of pointy, top angle of his head, and the big Adidas, leaves on his head, Pete Sagal has said officially, I believe, that he was inspired by Adidas when he put those on there. It's very noticeable when he swivels, and his eyes as well. So it's there's a large set of pixels moving around that makes it very clear. I think if the character design had been different, it wouldn't have worked as well. But I think that was an accident. I don't think it was. It's not like they made Manny's head long to make it easier to see when he's looking at things. I think it was just a happy accident. So to make that work, this is another case. So inverse kinematics came up a lot while we were working on the game. So inverse kinematics is the idea in a 3D world where it's like, okay, I want this character to grab this thing. Okay, inverse, figure out in reverse the animations necessary for him to reach out and grab this thing from whatever position he's in. So if this character's standing here and there's a thing he needs to grab over here, rather than animate him and have him have to stand in the perfect position for that to work and have it be, pre-canned animation that would line up, you would drag his hand out. And so this first notion of inverse kinematics came up over and over again. And we had to constantly make decisions. And this is similar to the Into the Shadows thing, where we had to decide, is this a physics game or is this an adventure game? And is this any position, any action game, or is this canned animations with artist tuned, goodness? So there were inverse kinematics things we talked about for like the rope with the coral trying to get across the gap at the top of the offices. And Tim had this notion that was going to be a fun little physics game where you would actually cast a rope. And I was like, do you understand? Do you have any idea what would be involved in adding a physics engine to this game? Are you mad? There were a few, the bone beavers, a few others, the spiders in the web with the bones, various places that it would have been fun to use physics, but it was going to be just too much for too little. And inverse kinematics was part of that. Was like, okay, if we need mana, you're standing in the right place. We want, you can be at any number of these places and have the fire extinguisher work for the beavers. You want it to be inverse kinematics that he's going to track the beaver down wherever it is in space and sort of dynamically generate that animation. And there's going to be too much computation and it messed with the art pipeline too much. And the head was the same way. The notion that inverse kinematics to make his gaze vector track whatever it was one thing to make his head do it. And I did that initially, but it looked really boxy and terrible because it was basically his head just kind of spinning in space. It was terrible. He needed this notion of, he has a neck, and when people move their neck, there's 3 vertebrae or however many cervical vertebrae you have that need to move and pivot and twist. And so the notion that if Manny's going to look up, I need to take that. It's not just, twist your head. It's the whole thing goes up, and therefore the angle that you're trying to get to needs to split across multiple joints. So that was something I did, and it was a hack. We basically said, look for the joints named X, Y, and Z, and take the angle we're after and split the angle by 3 and add it to the animation. And luckily it worked. For that very constrained case of doing exactly that, that was enough. So we got away with that. I didn't have to write an IK solver, which I got really scared about for a while. And
they used the same mechanics in Escape, so it worked well.
Yeah, and I think it. But again, Guybrush's head is not a big signpost. I don't know if it works as well as Escape. But on the other hand, there's more polygons there, and so maybe you can see better.
And you can also see the commands at the bottom.
True.
You can see what he's looking at. It tells you.
Well, I think that was something where maybe we went too far on Grim Fandango, and that was a pullback from that of well, what am I looking at? What am I choosing to interact with here? There's something over there he's looking at, but I don't know what it is. I haven't picked it out myself what he's looking at, or that it's interactive, because sometimes things were really obviously interactive because they were 3D, or sometimes they weren't because they were part of the background and it was a 2D animation when you interact with them. So I think that was you go from a hunt the pixel complaint that people had before to a different complaint, which is, well, I can see there's a thing, but I don't know what the thing is. So that's maybe Escape is going a little bit better there to have you. And that's also an opportunity for jokes. Whenever you have text descriptions of things, it's an opportunity for jokes. I think Escape was much more into that.
I see in the back over there that you have a book of sketches from Grim Fandango.
I do. So this is that close at hand.
Is that true?
I was preparing.
Is that true, or do I need an eye test?
Well, so I mean, there's various things up here. So you got up here. This is your Grim Fandango and your shrink wrap, which I only have one copy of right now. I didn't know how precious they were going to be. I gave them away to all my friends and family, and not realizing. There's a little there's some Day of the Dead stuff here. This little guy over here was on my desk at LucasArts at the time, and that one over there, and I kept some various mementos. So there were some things down here, but one of the things I was doing before I was preparing for the interview was I was going through some of the materials I kept from the time. So I think these are interesting for people to see. Like these are actual like of the day, like, you know, lots of paper. But these are things that we had. Like we had the I think Tim has published the design document online, but like everybody got a copy of the Grim Fandango design document, and so it has things in it like you know. Oh, here's a printout of all the bugs that I fixed or left open in Grim. So if there's a bug in there that you're mad wasn't fixed, it's probably in here.
Right. Are there A's, B's, C's, B's, or E's?
I mean, these are all A's. So you can see like it's got down the list here. So we've got, you know, here's a bunch of A's and there's some B's down there.
So these were never fixed?
These were fixed or vanished. So it looks like these are all over there. But there's a there's a couple that are open. Yeah.
You published the list.
Yeah, I don't know. This doesn't seem like the whole list because it's only 2 pages, but no, there's other stuff. There's other things in here about like we had the so this is the puzzle document. Whoops. Got my screen. Puzzle document I think Tim has published, which I think I'm very proud of. So I'm down there. I'm not just a technical person. I do design. But this was the sort of result of you know, all the sort of brainstorming before that we went into production. So, you know, the map of locations, things you would normally see in a hint book, but that actually are part of the game. And there's a lot of what was interesting about the game is that the puzzles were sort of written in and among the cutscenes. So it's sort of the story is told at the same time as the cutscene, as if it was linear. Lots of Chan art, obviously embedded in here. So little bits, and you know, this document I think is available online because Tim posted at one point and got in trouble. So you can get that one. And I definitely, anybody who's doing narrative in games or puzzle design should definitely check it out. And this one is more production stuff. So let's see what we got here. I think Tim has posted the Fandango viewing list. This is like references that the game draws from, a lot of noir movies and what's good to look at them and why. You know, on the waterfront, they're all in there. I think Tim posted that as well. This has not been posted before. This is the Grim Fandango technical specification. This is a document I wrote. And so this was basically saying, like, what is the game and what is the engine? And so it talks a lot about this game lands between the 2D adventure games like this. And it kind of goes through, like, where are we in time? So this is contemporary, you know, written 97. You can see, I don't know if it's going backward on your screen or not. Talks about running out soft image, and then talks about what goes in. So all these different parts of the other games, they're all listed. The different libraries, LEC Smush there, and Render Droid. What comes out? So this is like things that might be reusable. We talked about Lua a little bit. But also the chore library and chore editor. This is something I'm pretty proud of how it worked. This is one of the few games we had at the time, and I think a lot of games still don't do this very well, where you could literally have the tool set up and the game is running in one window and the tool is running in the other. You could be manipulating things live. Or you could be like, hey, there's a bug in this script and I'm going to paste in a new version of the script and have it compile it and send it to the game engine on the fly and run it. That became very influential actually for Kevin Bruner, who was the other engine programmer who went on to found Telltale. He was like, well, when I went to he gave me a tour of Telltale. He's like, all we've done is re-implement the Grim toolchain, you know, and it's all the same stuff. But he said the chore tool in particular was really influential. So the chore library in the editor, that's the thing that puts up the costumes, so is the animation. File types, tools and components. Yeah, so all the different tools from Jedi Knight are referenced in here. So yeah, this is a great doc. I wish I should see if I can. Still says
publish
proprietary.
It. Let's see if Disney cares.
You know, I know some of the people who are in charge of the rights over there, so I should talk to them and see if they care. I doubt they do. I don't think
you should, because Eric Wilmander doesn't post the source code for many of the Scum games. He has the source code for all of the games.
As it happens, one of the things I have also not posted is that I have a couple CD-ROMs full of the actual Grim Fandango Grime Engine source code and the Lua scripts. Again, I think hugely influential for people to learn from. And when they posted the Quake source code, the Doom source code, you know, launched a whole generation of game programmers. So I think there's a lot to be learned from internal, like what does a game look like in reality? What actually shipped and what was good enough to ship, or what do people, you can learn from comments and code to learn a lot. Yeah, this is a good document. Damn, I knew what I was doing. I did walk out with a copy of the actual engine source code and the shipped assets, the sort of what we call the baked assets, prior to being bundled up into a CD. I don't have the source assets, but those ended up being something that came in handy when they started looking around for Grim Fandango Remastered, and were asking, does anybody have any of this stuff? We don't know where anything is. And I was like, well, I might have walked out with some of this stuff. I didn't walk out with anything really cool like Peter Chan concept art, but
maybe it's in the LucasArts archives
somewhere. Let's see, viewing list. So the other thing is, I talked about the notion of sets and setups. There's this notion that the set is like a movie set or like a soundstage, and then a setup is a particular camera or camera angle. So we had for everything in the game, we had, so like as an example, this is a set and setups report. So it's got, here's the set, and then the setup is a particular camera angle, and then the description. And so you can see kind of, this is a lot of Peter Chan art that I think people don't realize exists, which is that he, in addition to sort of big concept art, he also did this stuff that's like very quick sketches. This would be the equivalent of like an animatic, I guess, for other stuff. When they do a movie, they're going to do kind of storyboard it out. But there's just beautiful kind of, only really intended for this res, little sketches he did of all kinds of things. So that you can see, he's doing the autopsy there. So we got things like that. And then, this is the kind of thing I think it's really good for people to see, like understand, like there's
I agree.
A spreadsheet of like, what are all the sets and setups, and, what are the files that exist and that need to exist to be rendered out. And then we're tracking these assets that they be created. I think if people
do you also have a dependency chart over there with all the puzzles and how the game flows? Yeah.
I think that was, so this is a map. That's a map of locations, like which locations need to connect to which locations. And those are the each set had an abbreviation for what it was. And then I think the design doc is the one you're thinking of, which has the notion of which puzzles lead to which puzzles. Yeah, this is location layout. You're thinking of this kind of stuff. So this is a map of year one in Grim Fandango of like what's the puzzle layout, and it's largely linear until the end of the year, but that's showing like what's the sort of sequence of puzzles you're going to encounter. And then for year two, though, it sprouts out all over the place. Yeah, so year two is much more nonlinear. You could be working on any of these three puzzle chains at the same time. So that gives you a sense of it. Year four narrows back in, but again, we want, if you're stuck, or we always wanted you to be able to go work on something else. And I think that's, again, like really instructive for people to learn, like, oh, that's how you kind of conceive of this stuff and think of it. There was a sketch here on this one, just in terms of layout of the world. So that kind of stuff. Anyway, yeah, these things exist. They're on my shelf, and I would love if they were all.
I think it's better to ask forgiveness than to ask for permission. Just post them online.
But it's easy for you to say that when you're the person who wants the thing out in the world, and I'm the person who'd have to face the lawyers.
Come on, Disney's lawyers. What can they do?
Yeah, Disney's lawyers not famously litigious in any way. But yeah, I do know some of the people over there who are, it's funny because when the remaster happened, it was kind of a brain trust of people coming together from different angles trying to get the rights at the same time. And people at Sony when I was there, people at Disney, and people at Double Fine all try to get the rights at the same time. And it turns out, we're all trying to get the rights. Why don't we all actually all work together and make this thing? So that's where I came in handy. Gave Tim my CD-ROMs and then had to pester him for a few months to get them back. And like, who would know? Like there were things that were stored on tape that like nobody had a working version of the machine that would read the tape kind of stuff. So who would know, and who would know how that stuff worked, and kind of pieced it all together at the end.
Now, how difficult would it have been to add mouse support in the original game?
I mean, a lot of the game's interface was just written in Lua, so it's just scripting it. A lot of it is testing, to be honest. Just, having multiple modes of playing the game and testing it that way. But on the other hand, I think that the mouse conversion that came out after, like a fan conversion that was eventually folded into the remaster, that was done just by adding Lua scripts, ultimately in the end. So it's definitely possible. I think Tim was pretty committed to no mouse on screen. Again, this comes down to the notion of like every pixel on screen should go into the scene, and as little interface between you and the scene as possible, as little to remind you that you're in a game as opposed to like seeing something very cinematic as possible. Yeah, the tank controls, we debated a lot because you might be pushing forward on the tank controls and then like the camera would switch. And it's like, well, does forward still mean the same thing? And so there's this notion of character relative versus camera relative. And if it's not camera relative, if it's camera relative, it feels right, but it also gets very floaty. And because Manny starts doing these sort of weird, like he moves in the direction you want, but he's also turning at the same time. And we kind of had to decide what to do. And so Tim decided that like the number one thing to focus on was tank controls and character relative tank controls. And, I mean, if people hadn't played years and years of Scum Adventures, would they have complained so hard? Probably not. But obviously a lot of people are much happier playing it with mouse, and it feels more discoverable to them. So it's hard to say. I mean, when we were doing things at the time, we didn't, this is in the days before you had the internet and a ready cabal of people you could playtest things with. So when we were testing things, we were testing them against friends and family or other people at the company who were themselves gamers who we knew. And so there wasn't this notion of like, we're going to focus test this, or we're going to like have a wide beta and see what the big issues that come up. It was like 10 people, the most that would try something out and give you some feedback on what they call the pizza orgy night, when they get a bunch of pizza and like have a bunch of workstations and have people sit down and have a bunch of people watch and play over their shoulder. And today you do that over Twitch, right? You can do a beta over Twitch, and you can have developers watch people playing their game over Twitch on a closed beta and learning things from watching players. That's incredible. Like we did, that's a massive change in the way these things work. So, had we done that at the time, maybe we would have seen a lot of people, christening themselves about tank controls and would have made a change. But as it was, I think, again, cleaving to the creative vision and sort of idea of and concept of this.
Or maybe it would have gotten the game canceled.
Maybe it would have gotten the game canceled. Who knows?
I mean, when, with games like Sam & Max Freelance Police and Full Throttle Hell on Wheels, it was around the same time that a lot of people got high-speed internet in the early 2000s. And so LucasArts got cold feet and canceled both of them.
Yeah.
So you never know what feedback. Usually the most vocal people are not the ones that are your target audience. We saw that with fandom, Return to Monkey Island.
Toxic fandom.
Yep. We saw that with Return to Monkey Island when Ron Gilbert got his share of
how dare you change the art style? Yeah.
Yeah.
Toxic fandom is its own thing, and this notion that people identify so closely with the form and the context of something that changing it is somehow seen as an assault on them. I don't get it. I see how pervasive it is and how much people want to tell other people how much they should hate something that they enjoy, or how much something is a wrong decision to change something that they liked, even though they're not necessarily the target market. It's really hard. It's a scary thing about being creative at all these days, is the horde of people who can be unhappy and disproportionately make your life miserable, even though they're a small portion of the public or your audience or the people who like you. So, yeah.
Now, regarding the cutscenes in the game, how did you capture them? Did you actually use gameplay scenes and script them out and then video capture? Or
no, in most cases, well, they were using game assets. We were really clear that we didn't want the cutscenes to look like they had higher res versions of the character than you were playing with. We wanted that to be very consistent. And they use the same background sets, but they can do things like move the camera, right? You can swivel the camera around Manny as he approaches Domino at the end of the world, which you can't do in the game itself. Same set of animators, same people doing it. I think anything that was full screen, we did pre-render, because it would mean less art tech time. So things that, for the very end of the game, Half-Life came out, and we were just like gobsmacked because they put their cutscenes in the engine fully. And if you walked away while somebody was talking, they just like, fuck it, you walked away while the guy was talking. Whereas we were very much tightly controlling, like, what was the experience of this conversation? Gordon, what are you doing? As the machine's falling apart around you, you could choose to go do something else, or you could choose to somebody's, they did enough to like the eyes would follow you or the head would follow you, but they're like, you could just walk away. We didn't want that. We wanted very tight control over those particular story beats and those transitions. And again, the sort of a cinematic idea. But there were a lot of other things that were done in engine, or things that were done after the fact that people came up with after the dialogue was written that we hadn't really anticipated, or that didn't need a particular camera movement or anything like that. We tried to reserve the full screen stuff, things like the octopus getting into the sub, but really hard to do in the game engine for very little benefit, for like one throwaway moment. But I love when the octopus swims in the sub and his eyes pop up in the portal. That's awesome. There was some give and take, though, in that the style of the game, when we decided on animating textures rather than geometry, I think Guybrush in Escape from Monkey Island, his mouth moves and the head changes shape. Manny's head doesn't. Well, actually, his head changes shape a little bit because his jaw comes down a little bit. But in general, it's mainly textures change, right, for his mouth. And if you take apart the game, you see, A, E, I, O, U, Y, W, whatever. There's these set of phonemes that every character has. And so when we decided to animate the textures, that presented a problem for the animators because they were trying to make these cutscenes in soft homage, and they're like, soft can't do that. And so I talked about that chore tool that was able to coordinate the 2D and 3D stuff. It actually got really convenient for me to say, well, I made a thing for making talk chores so that you can specify those phonemes for the character. I'll make it so that you can also export the transitions, and then you could feed that into soft homage. So soft homage did have the ability to say, list what texture should be used here over each frame. And so it's kind of back and forth. I actually used the game tooling, and the animators loved it because it just presented the character's face, and they could just listen to a line and lip sync it along, and then export it and just generate a list of file names, which is what soft homage wanted for the texture. Soft homage didn't have any notion of anything other than that. And so that meant that the lip sync could be hand synced for cutscenes and put back into soft homage. So that worked out. We did lip sync for the characters in the game as well. So does that answer the questions about the cutscenes? Mm-hmm. Okay. So while we're talking about lip sync, though, I want to talk about that because that was another thing that I think was novel in this game and maybe makes an interesting data point. In every Scum game before this, characters have something called the mumble chore. And the same way they have a walk chore or a talk chore, they have a mumble chore. And the mumble chore is what moves their face when they're talking, and basically just flaps their face. And, we've done things in the past where like you try to take the waveform, you take the amplitude and the frequency, and you try and make the width or the height of the mouth. It just looks terrible. That's not how people talk. But somebody had the brilliant idea in an early Scum game to say, we just need to do natural-ish transitions rather than just random transitions. So I'm going to animate them saying the word watermelons. And that's the mumble chore. So each character has to be animated saying the word watermelons. So watermelons. And if you just play it back to back, it's watermelons, 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 watermelons. And that's like, it looks okay when you're not looking too closely at this character, or low res or far away or whatever. That's like, yeah, his head flaps while he says the thing. We didn't want that. It didn't look very good. I hate to say, if you play Grim Fandango and anything other than English, you saw watermelons. If you look carefully while the character is speaking, you will see that they are saying watermelons, 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 watermelons. But for English, at least, we wanted to go further. So amplitude and frequency was not working very well. I didn't know anything about this, but I was like, oh, phonemes. What's a phoneme? And it turns out a phoneme is like how break down a word. That's phonetic spelling. That's phonemes. And the notion that, what you don't really want the amplitude and frequency of the sound. You want the phoneme for the word. So you want to be, for this sentence, this line, what is the sequence of phonemes and what is the timing? And that determines which face position I should show at a different time. And I had no idea how to do that, but there were some very scary looking research papers about how to identify phonemes. And this is where, again, kind of happenstance and exactly of the period, using whatever worked. So if you remember Clippy, Microsoft's Clippy. So Clippy was part of Microsoft's, I think they called it Assistant or Avatar SDK. And so if you remember, Clippy wasn't the only choice. You could also choose like Einstein or a little dog. And they had this notion this was going to be a huge deal. And so they had invested in this whole SDK for this stuff, where you could also have spoken lines, and you could generate phonemes for those lines and then use that to drive the character. So that Microsoft had actually done this. They had implemented that really hard paper for phoneme recognition. And it was part of their SDK. There's this tool where you could like put in the text for what was being spoken and then put in the audio file. And then it would say, okay, I'm going to sort of reverse engineer and figure out here's the phonemes and here's where they drop in that timeline. And so in my research, I found this thing. I'm like, oh, I'm going to use that. And so I reverse engineered it. It generated this wave file with phoneme data, and I reverse engineered that. It was really simple to figure out. And I was like, all right, I'm going to yoink that out and use that so that whenever a line is played, I'm also going to do the phoneme animation that goes with it. And it worked really, really well. And I was like, oh, this is cool. Only problem is we have 8,300 lines of dialogue. And this tool requires you to literally do file open, get the wave file and then type in the line and then press generate and then wait until it's done and then say save file. And so I ended up writing basically a macro recorder. I was not a Windows programmer by any means. I credit Chuck Jordan, who you should also talk to at some point. He happened to have all the Windows chops. He turned me on to C++ Builder. I used Borland C++ Builder as a tool at the time that allowed you to do, sort of very rapid prototyping. And I wrote a little tool called Zombie Typer and turned it loose on a database of like, here's all the lines, here's all the files, type it in, and it generated and recorded which ones it didn't have. So it basically did all 8,300 lines of dialogue over the course of a couple of days because it took that long. And then for the ones that it couldn't do, I kind of asked for the animators for a couple others, and then the others it says watermelons. And that was especially helpful for Glottis, because Glottis saying watermelons, his mouth has huge amounts of white space, and it just does not look good. But when he goes, whoo, Manny, and he sees his mouth go whoo and close up like that, and they go Manny, and it's dead on. It makes a big deal. It is a big difference. It looks great. So I'm really happy that worked, and whoever at Microsoft had to fall on their sword for Clippy becoming a punchline, 30 years later. I thank them.
Well, at least something good came out of Clippy.
That's what I'm saying. Clippy. What does Manny have in common with Clippy? And the answer is this phoning SDK. That also came out of some other things we did there around the dialogue. I think they were really important. That I think again were not. They were done for other Scum adventure games before this, ever since there had been talkies, but I think not to this level. They always had this notion of like the text export. So the notion that like we're writing text for what the characters are going to say, and a lot of it is done kind of iteratively, and as new jokes come up and new ideas, and sort of is done directly in the game engine code. And we got to extract that, and that becomes a list of all the lines that we need each character to say, and then you send it off to a recording studio in LA with the actors who were cast, and they sit in the booth and they say all the lines. The thing we did that was different was I said my brother was a movie guy. He's also a screenwriter. And at the time he'd been talking about, this final draft thing that everybody uses for writing screenplays is like a very specific format for how screenplays get written. And there's this notion of like, exterior night, the set or whatever. And I was like, so that's what people see when they go into the recording studio, right? There's a script and it's in this format. He's like, yeah. And I was like, that's interesting. So what I did is I wrote some Perl code because Perl's how you manage text at that time. Some really grotty Perl code that would basically run through all the text extraction rather than just extracting the strings and saying here's the character and here's the string. It would look for things like a comment beforehand to say breathily or like scared or whatever for the cue, but it would also look like what set was this in, what setup. And what it outputted, rather than just putting out the text file, I actually, because HTML was a thing, the web was a thing now, I output HTML that looked like a screenplay. And so I did that so that the actor would get something that looked like a real script, so that they were used to seeing it, including all the cues and like, where are we? It's an exterior at night, and I'm scared, and I'm talking to this other character, and I can see I don't just see my lines, I see the lines that the other character is saying sort of interspersed. And then the other thing I did was I made a table with every character on the top and on the bottom, and I said, okay, which characters talk to each other the most? And then we used that when we scheduled the actors in the studio to say, oh, Manny and Meche are going to talk together a lot. Manny and Domino are going to talk together a lot. Let's get them all in the studio the same day. And so rather than it being serial like with each actor when they're available, we actually booked them in there, and I actually generated for each pair of characters, here's your shooting script, your recording script. And so they were able to walk in, and so Manny and Meche each had their copy of the script with exactly their lines and the scenes that they were in, with all the context they needed. And so that's where I think a lot of the chemistry and a lot of the snappy dialogue back and forth between them, because they were actually there. And in a lot of these other games, Sam & Max is one, there's others, the actors are not actually present at the same time. And so they're not responding to each other, they're not responding to each other's delivery. And they can't talk about how they're going to play out the scene. And so I think that was one of the things I did. Dario Farrell, who was the voice director, told me that made a huge difference the first time he'd had that level of sort of, Hollywood ready, prep, which is really cool. And I feel really good about that. And that ended up being a feature in the game because when you play the game, I was like, well, okay, let's just, whenever you say a line, or whenever we transition sets, I'll just output the HTML for that. And that's how you get the transcript in the game, which is a feature. So I think those things were all kind of linked together. Lip sync and the text extraction that end up going into the zombie typer, and then how we did the voice recording. So I'm kind of proud of all that. And then another story along that line is one of the few scenes where we did not get lip sync and we didn't get captions was when Glottis sings the Rusty Anchor song. So there's there's this whole Rusty Anchor, like a bunch of red herrings. One of them is a song that you can ask Glottis to sing, and he sings the Rusty Anchor song. And there's no lip sync for it, and there were no captions for it. And it was impossible, because it was all recorded as like the guy actually singing with the music. There was no way to extract it out. I did that by hand because when we put out the game, we got some complaints from deaf players that they were having a hard time because there was no lip sync and there were no captions. It was just playing the audio. And so I actually went back and hand animated it. The phonemes I acted like an animator and Got the funding
And released
in place.
it as a patch.
What's that? And it's in the patch.
Released
Yes,
it as
when
a
you patch
patch.
the game, one of the things it does is it adds subtitles and lip sync for the Rusty Anchor song.
Well, you guys did a great job with the lip sync and the voice recording. It's these touches that make these games so great.
I think that's the thing is people don't recognize. Like when it works, you don't notice. Like if we just said watermelons, it probably would have been fine. If we'd recorded the actors separately, it would have been okay. But when you add all that stuff up, then it,
because around that time, 2 years prior to Grim Fandango, Tomb Raider came out, and a lot of the talking scenes don't even have lip movement.
Yeah.
Like they have texture of the face, and that's it. They're talking, but you don't see their lips moving.
Yeah.
And so to go from that, not to just seeing their lips move, but to see a perfect lip sync.
Yeah. Which again, I'm sorry to everybody who didn't play it in English, but Microsoft didn't put out the agent. It was agent, Microsoft Agent. They didn't put out the Agent SDK in any of the languages. Otherwise, I could have done it for other languages too. And I think that's actually something somebody could add if they wanted to as an aftermarket thing. If you want to have somebody who's using today's technology, I'm sure it'd be very easy to reverse engineer the phonemes that should be there. And if you put in the data, if the data is present, the game will use it. So
nowadays you can ask ChatGPT to rewrite Grim Fandango and Now, moving on to the remastered version, you said that you had the source code and the final renders of the scenes and the characters themselves.
640 by 480, 16-bit backgrounds. I had those. I didn't have the 32-bit, massive resolution ones.
Well, it was apparent in the remastered version because, the remastered versions of Day of the Tentacle and Full Throttle had the games turning into widescreen. And everything is high res, but with the remastered version, they added bars on the sides to keep the game in the 4:3 aspect ratio.
Yeah.
And what did you use to upscale the backgrounds? Did you just upscale them in Photoshop?
So I will say I was not involved in the technical production on Remastered. I was there I provided all the assets that I had and all the knowledge. I answered questions on how the engine worked, but I did commentary, but ultimately I didn't have any hands in the code. So I didn't have a hand in the production process, nor did I have a hand in the royalties, but I digress. It was all for free. As far as I know, it was basically exactly what you would see. You take a 640 by 40 image, you put it up at a higher resolution, and you just start, drawing over it. I don't know if they had any particular process to accelerate that, or if it was all done by hand. I'm sure today you would use a Midjourney or something like that would paint in detail.
But I don't think they actually drew over it. It was actually the backgrounds as is.
Oh, really?
That's why the difference is so.
Now I think about it, they might have had to because of the Z buffer. The resolution had to be. If they were just drawing over it in 2D, they lose the 3D wouldn't match exactly, and they would probably get artifacts.
Maybe the Z buffer was created manually because these are the same images. So that's why in the remastered versions, it's so apparent that Manny is high res, his textures were recreated, while the backgrounds themselves are the original backgrounds from the game.
My understanding is that they had done some research trying to find the original assets, the pre-baked assets, not the baked assets, which would be like the actual soft homage renderers and the actual soft homage set to scene descriptions. They could potentially render it again from scratch. I don't know how far they got with that. I know there was a lot of stuff that was on tape, and there were not many tape drivers that understood that format of tape anymore. I think there was something about them getting that working to get some audio stuff out, but I don't know if they actually managed it for the soft homage. But it would take a lot, and I think games. What was the article last week or the week before saying something like 90% of games are basically lost because game developers have been terrible archivists of their source assets and their source tool chains. So to reproduce things, to do it right, and I think some bigger publishers understand to do this today, you would actually make virtual machine images of Windows 95 with the exact version of, soft, or this SGI machine with soft homage and so you have an exact image of that. that you would then bring up in a virtual machine editor and like be able to work with. But to bring up those assets from tape and then also get a version of Windows or SGI's IRIX operating system and then a version of Softimage with the Mental Ray plugin, with whatever licensing hurdles they had, and be able to then take that out and then do something useful with it, it's asking a lot. But, it's
a task for Aaron Giles.
Task for Aaron Giles, if anybody can do it. But no, I think it's really tragic that there's Pacific Film Archive and there's all these, and the studios got really good at like, we have the original film, we have the original negative, and they're kept in these climate controlled vaults and things like that. We're better preserving film than we are preserving games in this digital media, which sucks. I think about all the, we use jazz drives to back things up at the time. Who the hell has ever even heard of a jazz drive at this point? Well, at that time, it was the cheapest, most effective way we had to back things up. So yeah, it's a real tragedy. And I think I'm happy they were able to do as much as they did. There's a lot of things I would have liked to see them do. I would have loved to see them have higher res backgrounds and higher res buffers as a result. I would have loved to see, the animation. I will say, Grim Fandango's target frame rate was 15 frames a second because we were dealing with, again, whatever's on sale at CompUSA the Christmas before. And so if we could manage 15 frames per second, it was great. But what that meant is that if your animation keyframes were only 15 frames a second, it was fine. The minute you go to 30 and 60 frames per second, all of a sudden you have this boxy sort of robotic interpolation, because the other thing that we didn't have a lot of time to put effort into, or it was a luxury, was how we interpolated between keyframes. So Grim Fandango and Jedi Knight do what's called lerping. It's linear interpolation, which is basically, it's literally exactly what it sounds. It's like, here's one point in space, and here's another, and between this time and this time, it needs to move from here to here. So we're just going to linearly interpolate over time from here to here, where in reality, it might be that's part of a big curve where it's like it moves really fast and it slows down and comes back, and all this little nuance of the performance that the animators put in is lost in those baked assets. But there's things you can do with the math where instead of doing linear interpolation, you can do slurps, spherical or spherical linear spherical, some other, it stands for something. You can do splines, the various splines to do those things. And there's new things you can do now with splines that are what are called interpolating splines, which means they still hit the actual points in space. They don't approximate it. They go exactly to that point, but they still handle like the transitions between them. I would have loved to see that happen in the original game. We never had time to do it. I would have loved to see it happen in the remaster. It kills me if they didn't. Because when I look at the remaster, I see Manny animating, and like even in the first cutscene of him like opening the tube from the pneumatic tube and kicking it out, and he kind of looks robotic. You can see him kind of slide, his joints kind of slide, and that's this linear interpolation artifact that is really, really visible when you're going at high frame rates. At low frame rates, it's not really visible because your eye is filling in, and there's a frame rate, there's a keyframe for every frame that you see.
I think that the limitation there is the fact that you can switch back and forth between the remastered and the original version. So these two have to be timed accurately so that you can switch back and forth. Without the classic version, they probably could have fixed that.
I think they could have. I was disappointed they didn't. To me, it's very clear that they didn't do it. Another thing that I would have liked to see is, I know that this is maybe this is a place where like the toxic fandom would be like up in arms, but I always had the notion that like a subdivision surface, Manny's head, you can very clearly see the polygon artifacting around it, and it's a little distracting to me when the silhouettes have sharp angles on them. You could do a subdivision surface that again interpolates and uses the points of his head as a control mesh to do a subdivision surface, which means it would be a little smoother and kind of not get rid of those artifact silhouettes that you see of polygons. Again, could be done. Would change the look of the game more than I think people would probably be comfortable with, but I would have loved to see it at least and have the option. Yeah, I mean, so we're talking about frame rate. So we also talked about the patch earlier about adding the lip sync for the Rusty Anchor. The most infamous thing in the patch is the forklift puzzle. forklift puzzle is frame rate dependent. And so if the game was written to run at 15 frames a second, it's fine. You have plenty of time to drive the forklift through. But if the game runs at 60 frames a second and the elevator goes zooming past and you don't have time to drive the forklift over, that was the thing that was fixed in the patch. The other thing is where frame rates came up is that I think, our target machine was originally a Pentium 60 hertz, and then it became not hertz, 60 megahertz, and then a Pentium 90 by the time we were done. And there were certain bugs that only showed up at higher frame rates. And one of our last crash bugs was exactly that. There was a scene at the end of the world where at a high frame rate, it was possible for the looping animation to come back and be at 0 instead of 1 or something like that, and then caused a crash. And it only happened when one of the execs of the company who happened to have a very brand new, very high end machine was testing the game. And it was only happening consistently on his machine. And it was because his machine was consistently able to get enough frames per second that he would always end up in that gap where it crashed. But there were things like that, like where, you couldn't know that your game was good. And this is the mostly gone away in the PC game industry, but it's still there to some extent. You don't know if your game's going to break with next year's model. It's hard to tell. It's hard to test and know that it's going to be there. I think that's one of the things consoles offers, a very fixed platform. But even there, like, those games are going to be lost. I mean, this notion of game sort of curation of assets and be able to reproduce a working build, consoles are, it's going to be really bad if PlayStation eventually folds because, Elon Musk takes over or something and drives into the ground. You're going to have all these games for PlayStation. It's like nobody's going to be able to make or distribute them. And that's going to be a big pain. It's going to be a problem. So, yeah.
Eventually, the best tool for game preservation has been piracy all this time.
It has.
A lot of the people who either created emulators,
that's right,
even though the creators of the platform didn't allow it, or send them cease and desist letters, or just piracy in terms of saving the source code or the assets or the actual game, which was on physical media that no one has anymore.
So in your interview with Aaron Giles, did you talk about Connectics at all?
We did.
So, I mean,
in my first interview with Aaron Giles, I didn't talk about it. And then his father commented on the video that we didn't talk about it. So in my second interview with Aaron Giles, I rectified that.
I have a lot of problems with that now. Looking back, I'm such an open source person, and I very much view this preservation as a problem. When we left LucasArts, he went to Connectics, and I went to PlayStation. And so we're on the opposite sides of that Connectics. We never interacted over it or anything like that, but I knew that he was there and that what they were putting them through was really brutal. And that still happens today. You have RCPCX 3 and RCPCX 4. Now they're trying to do PS4 emulation. And it's like, I root for those people so much, and when I make Grim Fandango, I also wanted the tools to be out there. I wanted it to be the people who could make, it was a radical idea at the time, I want people to actually have the manual for how Lua worked and how the pipeline worked, so that if they wanted to write their own, it was machinima at the time was the name of the genre of like sort of writing cutscenes in game engines, that if somebody wanted to do machinima with Manny and Meche and Domino and Galatas, that they, let them, here's the Lua manual, and here's how you turn on the tools so you can debug what's going on and aftermarket. And so actually, we did some things to make the game resistant to tampering for piracy reasons, etc. They're only a fig leaf because I really want people to be able to take that stuff apart. So I know Serge, what's his name? Serge. I'm sorry, he made a I can't remember the last name. He made a great set of tools for unpacking all the Grim Fandango assets and understanding all the Jedi Knight formats for models and textures and things like that. Jimmy Jorgensen. Serge was his online name, Jimmy Jorgensen. I was delighted with that. And I really wanted, I wanted it to be like, when Doom came out and there's a million, custom WADs with custom level design, and Unreal, same thing. I wanted it to be that. I wanted to really enable, hey, if there's a shipped adventure game engine that allowed you to do that stuff, what would people actually come up with? But, we're still in this period where everything's proprietary and confidential, as opposed to like, enabling platforms of interested fans to do even more with it. And Star Wars has gone through
the legal departments of these companies don't think about the interest or the preservation of these games.
Yeah, they think about the value of what it ships, not what it enables or what it creates in the fan base.
And I'm sure that they know that doing so would not make them lose any money, because these games are out there. People keep buying them, or they stop buying them because they're no longer available. But having the source code out won't affect it either way.
I think there's a fear.
Affect the sales, and it won't get more. Maybe it will get more sales.
So another thing of the time, though, you have to remember, lawyers of the time were dealing with the ramifications of the GPL, the GNU public license, and the Linux kernel, and the notion of contamination, and the terror that if your game inadvertently incorporated something that had GPL, that you would have to give out source or be liable for someone else or whose stuff was in there or whatever. I think the lawyers always had this notion of like, our job is to reduce and avoid risk as opposed to protect and enhance value, which is a different thing, right? One is a very sort of expansive or open way of thinking about things. The other is a very cloistered and protective way. And I think at the time, the legal battles with the Santa Cruz operation over the Linux kernel and Oracle, or the Linux kernel claiming the Linux kernel was tainted with, commercial source code, and therefore the whole thing is a violation, shut down the whole thing. They're always terrified about that we'll be forced to stop selling the game because we don't know what's in there. And they had that problem with Lua. Like when I was using Lua, which was this open source component, and zlib, which is also, used everywhere. They were really nervous, and I had to be very careful with them with the licensing. And I think with Lua, I even asked them to make a change to license to make it possible. I don't remember. But with zlib, I had to go to them and say, look, this is the actual license. What are we worried about? And I think games are not, lawyers have to be on their toes to understand these open source licensing issues. And they have to understand, like, what are we responsible for or not, and what has to be in the heads of the game to meet the terms. And they were just not, I think most lawyers don't go to that level of involvement.
So they'd rather hide the inner workings of a certain game to avoid the chance that some developer used an open source library, without, and so he'll have to,
or whatever. Yeah. And I think that's, again, it's same way a lot of games are not available for network distribution because the distribution rights didn't include, that performance or that asset or whatever being used in any other form than on that disk. And therefore those games are now trapped. They can't be reissued. But I think that report was really sad to me. And, like I said, like this kind of stuff of like the artifacts of the game development to me are like hugely instructive. And like, Hollywood got this in the 1920s, right? They in 100 years ago, what's the shooting script versus the script that was licensed, and like, here's the marked up version from that actor, his copy with his notes on it, or here's the date. We kept all the dailies, all the different dailies shots, including all the versions we didn't put in. And then it allows you to do all these amazing things, 50 years later with all these behind the scenes and retrospectives and all these kinds of things, because they kept all that stuff. They didn't consider it, they considered it part of their heritage to keep it, and have people to be able to go back to it. So games are...
Well, it's funny that LucasArts didn't, because LucasArts, as we've seen with the other remasters, they actually remastered the voices for Day of the Tentacle by getting the original master tapes and then re-editing them, because some lines in the game were created by two takes that were edited together. Mm-hmm. So they had all of these edits, and they were able to recreate it. And again, that's the Hollywood
side of it, right? That's the Hollywood side of voice recording. That's well developed and well established.
Well, that's because LucasArts is a
film company,
subsidiary of Lucasfilm.
Right.
While at Sierra, they didn't keep anything, and all of their source code and master tapes are in a landfill somewhere.
And it was hard to imagine at the time that this would ever be remastered and that they would be interested in this stuff. And to some extent, it was always this notion of like, the bits and the atoms that are smashed together into these things that we put on a shelf, that is the product. And whatever was made beforehand, it doesn't matter. That's what's here. There wasn't a notion of, heavy franchising or reuse of assets. There wasn't a notion of reusable engines even. Scum was unusual in that it was an early reuse story. It's
storage.
It's very sad.
Storage was expensive back in the day,
and storage
hard drives were expensive.
And the robots are really expensive. If you want to do a tape robot, it was a lot. And so it wasn't like today where it's like, well, you pay Amazon, pennies on the gigabyte for them to do, cold storage on S3 or whatever. And why wouldn't you? And the other thing I think people don't get is they had this notion that companies would live forever. Everything was new and companies hadn't gone out of business a lot yet. And I think when you have that notion, that you're not used to the idea of like, oh shit, the rights are bound up in this company that no longer exists. If you haven't experienced those things, you don't prepare for them. And so I think everybody just assumed they'd be around forever. Like who would have imagined that LucasArts, was going to shut down and then like turn into a rights house at Disney? Or who would imagine that like Ion Storm, was going to implode so spectacularly? Like all these sort of stories at the time, but like, you don't start out thinking about the bad case or disaster recovery or, the disaster recovery at that point was more like if it'll stop production, how quickly we get back into production. It wasn't a matter of disaster would be losing the source assets. And so we should preserve those. It just doesn't happen. And, you see the Star Wars exhibits, like Lucasfilm had these huge, the original costumes, the original Yoda carefully kept in this, air conditioned vault so his latex wouldn't dry out and crack. And like, they were very attached to artifacts, and partially because they're tangible, they're physical, they're works of art, they're things you put on your shelf. And it's very hard to do that with a pile of bits.
And so we've talked about escape during our discussion about Grim Fandango, but I want to hear the specifics of the things you actually got to work on in the game.
So I will say, I will say my time on Escape from Monkey Island was very short. I was so burnt out at the end of Grim Fandango that I basically just like, I said, I'll see you in a couple months. And I just like walked away. I was really, really, truly spent. I poured everything I had into that game. They put me on as lead tech for Escape. And as I mentioned earlier, I was assistant designer for Grim. I was in there from the start, characters, situations, puzzles, jokes. And for Escape, I really wasn't. I was there as like, I came with the Grime engine. Here's the Grime, if Scum had a Scum Lord, I guess I would be the Grime Lord. Here's the Grime Lord over as the lead programmer for Escape from Monkey Island. And I was really burnt out. I didn't have my heart in it. It wasn't my game. It was, a game that somebody else was making that used an engine that I liked or that was, intimately involved in. But it was really hard. And so I didn't stay for very long. I wasn't there very long. And so honestly, my work on Escape from Monkey Island, there were some things that we did differently. Something we'd explored in Grim Fandango and only did, I think, on Manny's robe when he's in the Reaper costume was this notion of not just animating like a solid mesh, but like animating the points in the mesh itself. So like a flowing cape. Grim Fandango doesn't have that. It has, the sort of flapping piece of geometry. So we wanted this notion of like, can we actually, the same way we would go through a flipbook of 2D frames, go through a flipbook of 3D models. And so we were doing some of that early on, and I believe some of that got in the game. I'm not sure. But the question there is always, how do you compress it, right? And, it's not terrible because if you're going to compress, here's the original mesh, and then the points move only a little bit in each frame, it's tiny bit of delta compression, and maybe it'll work out. But I don't know how much that actually ended up in the game. I think we were trying to do that more, especially for the characters' faces, because they're going to move a lot more geometry. So I'm not sure how much they did that. And so instead of animating the textures, we were animating the actual model. And when I say animate, I mean animating which model was being. It was much more like Jack Skellington in Nightmare Before Christmas, where they had like 50 heads and they're swapping in the different heads or they're swapping in the different mouths. Much more like that on Escape from Monkey Island, as opposed to just changing the texture. The other thing, I think, again, we were looking at Dreamcast, and it didn't have a Z buffer. So the things we did there, I think I was just more of an advisory role. I didn't think it was going to be possible, but Randy Stevenson proved me wrong. Which is to say that, taking out the notion of a Z buffer in the hardware to say we have a stencil buffer, let's create a stencil buffer from our Z buffers. So what can we do to, they're still going to render things out. And we have the Z buffer background, but then we need to create a stencil buffer from that and then have it be like, more like a diorama, like different depths. And then the characters kind of walking between these things. You just need to know which things are in front or behind them. So I was there for that part, and let's see. I wasn't there for long, to be quite honest. But
that was the last project you worked on at LucasArts?
It was. As much as I'd had, a lot of sort of collaboration with those other projects, it's sad to say this. I think I had one game in me, and it was Graham. And, I think if we'd had better work-life balance, or if we hadn't overshot so much on that game and had so much crunch, maybe I wouldn't have burnt out and I would have been better able to approach it. But I think at that point, I didn't have the passion for that game that would take me through the burnout. And so I ended up leaving. I wasn't there very long. Something interesting happened over at PlayStation. Basically, they announced the PlayStation 2, and it was like, it's going to use Linux for the development environment. Like, well, I've always hated working in Windows. I hate Windows 95 and DirectX, and it's got a Linux development environment, and it's got all this interesting hardware in it, and it's going to do all this 3D stuff with this vector processor that's totally cool. And so I ended up going over there and getting involved in PlayStation R&D. But yeah, I mean, I gave up a lot when I left in terms of like things I love to do at the company or people I love to be with. But like, I think that I like working on tools and platforms and engines. That's a constant throughout my whole career, even since then. But in terms of creative endeavors, like in terms of, investing heart and soul in a game, I think Grim was it for me. I don't know that I could muster that much sort of creative enthusiasm after sort of burning out that part of my brain and working on that game.
And I think that around that time, a lot of the original crew that was working on these classic games had already left, like either years before or around the same time.
There was a bit of an exodus. I think a few things happened at once. Number one, we weren't getting paid. Just bottom line, whatever largesse the company thought they were doing, by whatever great thing they thought they were doing by telling us that we were the most profitable game publisher out there, despite being smaller. That didn't go over well. I don't know if others were quite as struck by it as I was, but people were leaving. There were companies out there that had a lot more money to invest, and they were attracting people. Storm Austin came after me, and they were offering a lot of money, but I didn't want to live in Texas. And glad I steered clear of Ion Storm, because a few months later it was on the cover of every magazine for all the wrong reasons. But a lot of people were like, you know what, I've grown up here and I know how to make games. And I think the other thing is that we were not given as much freedom. I think the concepts were becoming make Star Wars games, Obi-Wan, Shadows of the Empire, Masters of Terrascasi. All of a sudden it was like, make Star Wars games. Like, it's something turned on in George's brain where previously games had been left out of this sort of master marketer merchandising genius that George had. And like, famously Lucasfilm was built on the merchandising rights for Star Wars, which he insisted on retaining for himself, and then completely exploited with Kenner and made all these toys. George, Star Wars blankets and pillowcases and everything like that. For some reason, games had never been for him in the equation as marketing vehicles, and suddenly they were. And they were not being farmed out to other companies. They were using this company that had made very original properties to do it. I think that turned a lot of people off. and to be
around the
worthy.
same time you left for college, they regained their license to publish Star Wars games. So,
but it still took a number of years before they were really using it, right? I mean,
because they probably waited for
next
episode 1 to come out.
Well, Shadows of the Empire and Jedi Knight and Dark Forces all came out in that window, so they were still using it, but those were things
but
that
not as much as after 99.
And it wasn't based on the movies, right? It was totally original, right? So if you're Justin Chin, you got to make up all new Star Wars characters and planets and even weapons and things like that, and do live action cutscenes for Jedi Knight. Like, that's pretty awesome. You know, that's a lot of creativity in your hands. I think
the pre-episode 1 games were fun. Rebel Assault and Dark Forces, Jedi Knight, all of these were fun. But afterwards,
Shadows of the Empire made me vomit in one scene, literally, like, because the 3D. There's a puzzle where you're on these two opposite spinning things, and it's full 3D, and it's like I was playing the game and trying to make this jump and kept failing, and I finally just got up and vomited. But it was awesome, and it was great. It was like, you know, those folks working on that game and doing it on this sort of very kind of secret Nintendo hardware. And I'm sure, have you heard the anecdote about the controller for the N64?
What about it?
So for Shadows of the Empire, the controller design for the N64 controller was so secret, they weren't allowed to have it on the desk or visible while they were working on the game. So they had to reach into a box with holes cut in the side to use the controller to play the game, even to show other people the game. They had to like reach into a box to do it. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, I think
afterwards you moved to Sony after LucasArts released Escape from Monkey Island for the PlayStation 2. You went to Sony to work on PlayStation 2.
Yeah, I did. So I went for the PlayStation. I was very interested in Linux. I was very interested in non-photorealistic animation. So at the time, there was a convergence as 3D was becoming the look for games, and there was sort of like this notion that we just keep adding polygons and pixels until it looked like reality. And I thought that was making everything feel very same. And it still does. So these days, you can still tell like which engine the game is made with, and it has still this sort of tracking toward like film quality is like the bar. And I didn't like that. I always thought that, you know, there should be more artistic stuff than that, in the same way there was in animation. There was a Disney movie came out at the time, Tarzan, and they had this, what they call a system called Deep Paint, which was a sort of merging. They had these sort of 3D environments, but then the artists could sort of scrub back and forth through the 3D camera and the 3D environment and attach paint strokes onto things. And then that would stick with the geometry as it moves. They were able to like sort of hand paint all the 3D backgrounds for this environment and have it go through. And I was really interested in doing that in 3D. I was like, that would be a cool thing for games. So the notion of a game environment where the characters or the backgrounds were not polygons and textures, but were more like paint strokes in space that were attached to those things. Ironically, that's what Dreams does. So if you look at Dreams on PS4, PS5, it's a very unusual renderer. It's not like anything else in the industry. They've done some great papers about it. If you're interested in game development at all, I highly recommend it. You read it, just like what could have been, like this other notion, like, hey, there's other ways to render the world out there. But what Dreams does is it renders flex, what are called flex, as the sort of unit of sort of pixel unit that it renders. It doesn't render polygons. And it makes for a very interesting looking game engine, and it lets them do all kinds of interesting things with lighting. And it's very, very sort of unique and different. So I was very interested in that as a topic, non-photorealistic rendering. I was also interested in subdivision services for that exact reason, that I wanted to do it with Manny, and I wasn't able to do it with the hardware at the time. And I thought this PlayStation has this emotion engine thing that might be really good for pumping out that kind of, you know, tessellating geometry as you go. And so I was in the PlayStation R&D group for a while, and it turns out I'm really terrible at R&D. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I'm terrible at the R. I'm good at the D. So I was really good at making tools and really good at making like development environment stuff changes, or, really good at making frameworks for doing things, and not as good at the sort of like, throw all that out. You're not going to ship it. Just make a really cool demo. Make it that looks neat and experiment and try wild things. I was just not as good at that. I needed to have like, I'm working toward making something work. I needed a problem I was trying to solve, as opposed to try a bunch of stuff. And I think that kind of worked against my strengths. On the Grim Fandango side, they were weaknesses when it came to R&D. And there was a lot of pressure on PlayStation at the time. The R&D group was supposed to be sort of a show pony. So every couple times a week, Phil Harrison would show up and point to the very expensive hand scanner outside the door. Look how futuristic and how top secret our lab is here. I'm going to show you behind the scenes. Here's the workshop. And they would be working their way down and like, here's, Craig Reynolds doing a flocking algorithm. And here's this person doing, Rick Marks doing the iToy stuff, which became PlayStation VR in a decade later. And like, I'm furiously trying to get my code to compile, and watching them come down the road. And it's like, he's got somebody from Newsweek, stopping by the sort of, it's like the reptile house at the zoo, like, and here, this engineer's working on this and this. And eventually he got to the point where he would just skip me. I was pretty miserable because I never had anything working. But at the same time, I was working on some, I did interesting bits of code that fell out into, the PlayStation SDK, and that I gave a friend at Double Fine. I wrote this I won't say amazing, but it was amazing to me. This directed edge data structure, which I think is one of the papers I keep that, is like, seminal paper that everybody overlooked. Directed edge data structure that I gave him for Psychonauts. And then he said did get used, and that's how part of how Raz is able to walk on surfaces and things like that. That is. So I was good at making things like that and libraries and reuse and kind of collaborating that way, but I was not good at the sort of make something pretty or interesting in and of itself. To me, those had always come from the artists, and I was just the guy making the pixels and things move. So yeah, I wasn't good at that. I got very sad and depressed. And they said, well, how would you like to go work in the developer support group? And I said, yes, because I had been finding that like a lot of PlayStation 2 developers were really upset that there was this Linux-based development environment and you have to write a makefile, and they'd never done that because they'd only ever programmed in Windows or other environments, Borland environments that did those things for them. So things that were second nature to me from Berkeley Computer Science were really impediments for them. So I ended up writing a lot of things that were just helping game developers get things done. Here's a generic makefile that'll do all the right things with, this kind of assembly or whatever. So getting that done put me more in a mind of like, I really like serving other people. And that again is sort of me recognizing, I like enabling other people. I like platforms. I like to make tools for the artists. I like to make tools for other programmers. I like to do these kind of things. And very quickly, I started thinking about what is the developer experience on PlayStation, which at the time was pretty wretched. I mean, you would dial up to, you would get shipped some CDs with the SDK on it, and you would have a shelf of paper about this long of books with all the programming manuals, and that was it. And then you would call us and leave a message and have us call you back to try and help you out when you need support. So this was the dawn of the developer services group at PlayStation. When I got in there, I was like, well, there's this thing called the web. And we could have a website where people are able to get updates to the SDK without us having to mail them to them or know that they exist and have us mail them to them. And they could talk to each other about how they get things done. And we could put up sample code and they could download it and try it out. Wouldn't that be cool? And so while I was there, ostensibly to just answer people's questions, I very quickly pivoted toward what became the PlayStation DevNet Developer Network, which, as far as I know, is still like everybody says is like a killer thing that PlayStation has that the others haven't quite matched. But that was a while ago. But yeah, I switched into web development. I improbably came from game developer to web developer. All of a sudden, I was writing database and PHP code and learning about how to administer Apache and doing sysadmin stuff and trying to make DevNet go. And that turned out to be a big deal because then it turned out Europe also needed it, and they also spoke English. So we started using the same thing across territories. And then Japan needed it as well, and we did the internationalization. And then Korea became a market, and so all of a sudden we had this international single website for all PlayStation territories, for all PlayStation developers for the same content. And that was the first time PlayStation ever had that, because PlayStation is not a global company. At least at the time, it was not a global company. It was a regional company. And so it had these different presences and totally different staff in different countries. And this website, once we had it together and sort of, I just kind of moved from what I thought the developer experience should be like, kind of sucked other people in under that. So I ended up, eventually, there's other things that we did in PlayStation developer support. We had all the conferences, all the sample code that got put out, a lot of remote consulting. The PS2 Linux kit, I'm responsible for selling people on that and then running the developer website for that. So that was the sort of amateur, again, sort of enabling people who were interested in game development, like lowering the barrier to them I really wanted to do. So that's where the PS2 Linux kit came from. Which I guess is a collector's item now. I should probably look it up. It had a special PS2 Tux, Linux Tux keyboard and a hard drive that went into the hard drive bay for PS2, which was otherwise unused. And just sort of ended up looking after developer experience. And so at one point I was managing the developer support engineers who were sort of subject matter experts on all the different ways you could program and optimize for PlayStation, and then the conference material and the conferences and then the website. And I kept giving it away. So eventually it was like, oh, I talk to developers a lot, but I'm not great at that. So we should have a developer relations manager, and let's hire one, and I'll hand that job off to him. Or like, hey, we have these people who do consulting, and let's have a new person who does that. And so I was pretty good. I'm not much of an, I always tell people I'm not much of an empire builder. Like, I'm not the guy at the top of the pyramid that gets bigger and bigger, and I rise with it. I'm always like giving away the things that I don't like to do and keeping the things that I do. And one of the things I really enjoyed was, again, this sort of platform for developer services to talk to developers. And it did turn into some things. I got involved in a lot of weird stuff. There's things I won't talk about in terms of the PlayStation 3 GeoHot hacking case that I was involved in much more deeply than I'd like, and a very unpleasant chapter. But there were other things that I did around, like, I started the PlayStation advisory panel process, which became a huge part of all the platforms after PS3. I was the person who was like, hey, maybe we should listen to our developers and iterate on what they're saying instead of just making the best Blu-ray player and giving them the game platform on the back end of it. I got involved in, prior to the Gaikai acquisition, I was looking at streaming games. So I was the person who was evaluating different streaming game solutions out there and, kind of giving expert advice back to Japan about those. And I was a person who was saying, hey, if you add this ring buffer and make it really easy to record snippets of video, that's really good for debugging and being able to report things to from your QA department to say, instead it was pitched as that was cool button for consumers, but in reality that was a bug button for QA to be able to smash a button and get a recording and set it up. But then it's like, hey, if we have recording hardware, that's actually good for streaming your play out, and that would be kind of cool. And that turned into the PS4, So I got involved in a lot of things that ended up in features and for different parts of the hardware. Another one was like, we needed to do remote performance captures and, make it so that people didn't have to travel to get a performance capture off a game and see what's wrong. Using video conferencing to talk to developers instead of flying out every time, or video conferencing so we didn't have to fly to Japan as much. So I kind of got involved in a lot of stuff around, and, I was at PlayStation for PS2, 3, 4. I left before 5. I was involved in the PSP and PS Vita. I was involved in PlayStation iToy, and PSVR. I did 16 years at PlayStation. And so compared to my LucasArts career, my time at PlayStation was quite long. I was involved in a lot of stuff, but, it's more spread out.
So why did you decide to leave Sony?
Honestly, I talked about it being sort of a regional rather than global company, and we were constantly dealing with that friction across borders, and getting anything done was an exercise in generating consensus, but there were some people who were not interested in that. We were working on trying to unify the developer experience. I talked about, all the developers had the same experience across territories. The publishers did not. And so the experience of going through QA might, you passed in flying colors in one territory and the other territory refused to let you release, or you had to submit to each territory your final build and get it up on the store as if it was submitting to 4 different territories, when in reality it should all be the same assets and just, different text for the different territories. And so I was really interested and at this point I kind of got the agile bug, and I was more of a product owner than a developer. And I was more interested in what is the developer experience? What is the partner experience? And at one point I had convinced people like, hey, we should, everybody had agreed that we should be doing this. We should behave as one company. You shouldn't have to have like a relationship with 4 different subparts of PlayStation if they're separate companies with separate relationships. You should have one, and therefore the experience of all our touch points should all be unified as well. And so I was very involved in that. And at one point I had been told that I would be a new position called the PlayStation Experience Architect, or Partner Experience Architect, which to me was great. It was a dream job for me and would let me do a bunch of things in that company that I have been stymied from because I just didn't have the authority. It was always kind of, backseat driving to make things happen. And company couldn't handle it. There are people in territories who just were like, no, we don't want a global position. We don't want a single person responsible for that. Or if we do, it's not going to be him. It's going to be us. And at a certain point, even though I've been told I had that position, they wanted me to keep doing the job, but then they were stalling on announcing it to the rest of the company. So I've been working my butt off for months thinking that this is going to be announced. And I'd even ghost written the announcement for them myself, talking about my background. And they refused to tell me, like, at one point, I'm like, is this position, do I have this position or do I not? And it had been months. And I've just been like, are you never going to announce this? And they're like, just refusing to answer, because in Japan, like when there's something uncomfortable, you just don't speak. And like the first person to break the silence is the loser. And I was like, okay, let me cast my mind back to November 15th, which was the day that you told me that I was going to have this position. And if I just pretended that conversation never happened, would that be a better way to go forward? And they're like, yes, it would. And I was like, okay, thank you. Now I know I can stop breaking myself against the inside of this company, thinking I'm about to have all this power to do all these things. And in reality, I have none. So at that point, it was kind of what I call a morale inversion of it. Your morale can be shooting up, it's going up, and the morale gets inverted and the morale is going way down. And I just had this feeling that I'd hit the limit of what I could do in the company, and it was time to go. After 16 years of being at the platform side, which is sort of a hub of the industry, there's only a few of them. I didn't really want to go work at a game developer or a publisher. I'd seen enough of how they treat their people. And honestly, you had all the EA spouse and all these other sort of, quality of life issues coming up in the game industry, and endless crunch. I didn't want to go back to that. And so that I think that I'd had enough. I really felt like, I didn't want to work at Microsoft. I'd been on the opposite side of a trench from them for my entire career. And I certainly didn't want to work for Nintendo because I didn't want to go, Sony was a very westernized Japanese company, but Nintendo was not. And I didn't want to deal with even more bureaucracy. So yeah, I decided to get out. I decided it was time to leave the game industry, which is a thing people sometimes do.
And what did you do after you left Sony?
I became a Fed. This is a weird thing to say. I became a Man in Black. One of the things I really care about is climate change. And I've been for a long time, since like 99 or so, been like way ahead of where I could be to maintain happiness and understand what was going on. Like, okay, I was in Japan for PlayStation in 1999 when the US pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol. And international news at that time was like, what just happened? Oh my God, they were doomed. This is horrible. And I couldn't understand why on this international news stations I was watching in Japan, like, why is this a big deal? And it's not appearing on any news in the United States. It's not even a blip that this happened. And why do people care? And I started looking into climate change and understanding how big a deal it was and how much peril there was for the world ahead. And I was like, oh, this is a big deal. And so my whole time that I was at PlayStation, I was kind of watching climate change. I became a little more of a climate activist. And I decided, you know what, if I'm going to leave games, how do I leave the world better? And unfortunately, the most recent election was, I guess, 2014 before I left. And they asked people, like, what are your priorities, all the voters in the exit polls? And climate was like number 8 or like number 11. This is 2014, right? It was like, what's ahead of that? What are voters thinking about? What are the top issues? And it's like healthcare, jobs, like really bedrock, basic government functioning things where like they could not worry about climate change. Like people were worried about getting food in their mouths. And so I started just kind of asking around and saying, like, where should I go? What should I do? And I ended up like, I thought if games are this way and climate is this way, I kind of made a change to about, right here. And I ended up working for the federal government. There was a really unique pocket of people collecting in the government who were bringing sort of the agile product management, design thinking, user experience, iteration, bringing that to government services and trying to make government work better, because government systems in the United States are notoriously bad and notoriously slow to change and notoriously underfunded and done by the lowest bidder contractor and things like that. And I found this amazing set of people inside the federal government in this agency called the General Services Administration, who are sort of an internal consultancy for building shared services for the rest of government. And again, I really like platforms. I really like tools that enable other people. And so I ended up building this thing called cloud.gov, which is all about enabling all the other agencies to work more efficiently. There's like 7,700 pages of documentation you need to understand to write a 400-page document that allows you to launch a government system with all these controls. And I tried to like push all that down under the water like an iceberg so that you only need to know this much to launch and operate a government system. So I made something called cloud.gov, and that was really successful. I've been there for 9 years now. I trimmed out, came back. It's been a wild ride, but I think it's, I'm now, I did cloud.gov and I came back, and then I did data.gov and I came back, and now I'm doing sort of regulatory stuff for the government, but I think I need to work on climate for my day job. So actually I'll be transitioning, for any of your viewers out there who are looking for a multi-talented product manager / developer who is interested in working on climate problems, here I am. But yeah, so working in the government was its own adventure, just understanding how government works internally and where the dynamics at play. And I've now worked under 3 presidents somehow in those 9 years, because I came in at the tail end of Barack Obama, and then I worked under Donald Trump, believe it or not, and then, now Joe Biden. And luckily Donald Trump mostly was too busy criming to actually pay attention to us, and we got to still keep doing really good work, and that's why I stayed. But it's been an adventure, and there's again, like I say, if there's things that have served me really well, it's looking to enable others, right? Like, how do I enable artists to do things with their cutscenes, or how do I enable the tech artists to be more efficient by doing X, or how do I make it so scripters don't have to do this, or how do I make it so PlayStation developers don't have to write make files, or for me, it's always about looking to like, where can I magnify my impact out? And the government's a great place to do that. But I think I've done my time now. Everybody should contribute to your own government, and then you'll understand better why it doesn't do better.
Before we conclude our conversation, I have one final question. What are your plans for the near future, and how can people stay in touch with you?
Well, like I said, I would love to I want to make fighting the climate fight my day job. And, I really want to be an enabler for as many organizations or people in the climate fight as I can. And so I want to find organizations that are doing that can use a Bret-shaped person. Getting out of government service, getting back in the private industry. I don't think I want to go back into games, because unless games can fight climate, they're not where I need to be. I don't know. I honestly, government has its own version of burnout, which is sort of just fatigue of fighting, regulations and friction and overhead, and kind of doing everything with one hand tied behind your back. Thank your public servant whenever you can, because they are doing that, and it's more difficult. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have too many plans other than like figure out what's next. But all I know is that it needs to be pointed. If if games were here and climate's there and government was in the middle, I need to bend closer to that direction for me. It's not to say I don't love games. It's not to say that I don't think games are great. I still play games. But I just need my day job to be making a livable planet.
And how can people stay in touch with you?
How can they stay in touch with me? Well, I am not at all on Twitter anymore, but I am on Mastodon. So I am at Mogul, Mogul, at mastodon.cloud. I keep threatening to change to another server, but I haven't done that yet. But I quite enjoy Mastodon. I like the kind of low key and talking shop with people there, and lots of fun. How else? I don't know.
You may want to join us at mastodon.gamedev.place.
But I'm not a game developer. You know, it's funny. I see a lot of people from gamedev.place, but those are my friends who I still consider game developers. I'm just not. It's just not me. You know, I have a bunch of friends from government. This part of government called Technology Transformation Service, or 18F, where I am. Friends who started something called Public Interest Town, and I think that might be me. I'm a little bit more civic minded. Of like, you know, I'm here to serve in the open source community. I'm here to serve for climate. I'm here to serve for government. Even in games, I was there to serve, you know, the developer community. I have, you know, a bent toward making things better and helping people do things. So Public Interest Town might be a better fit for me, but I don't know. There's a million Mastodon servers out there. I'll move around eventually. Mainly, I just like to be able to keep in contact with friends. I've been in contact with Aaron Giles on Mastodon. I was not in contact with him before moving there, and it's been great to kind of reconnect with him and, you know, watch what he's doing with Dream, and it's been great. But yeah, I'm very open. If people want to ask me things, tag me in things, I'm happy to chat. I am very happy that Grim Fandango remains an inspiration for people to make, you know, off-brand T-shirts, and has lodged in people's hearts and minds. I'm really happy about that, and I'm happy to look at what people are doing.
Well, thank you so much, Bret, for hanging out and chatting today. It's been a total blast.
Well, thank you very much. I had a blast. It's great to walk down memory lane. And I want to say, you know, LucasArts was not all bad times too. It was, you know, it was tough. It was really a crucible period for my life, but there were fun times, you know. There were good things too. ILM Halloween parties and softball games at Skywalker Ranch and 4th of July parties at Skywalker Ranch. So I don't mean to downplay everything. I'm just talking about how it was for me.